Hey fam, this is OMNI Wizard. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Dumbledore sealed Harry's magic and breaking it made him unstoppable? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. The cage beneath the skin. The rubble was still smoking when Albus Dumbledore stepped through the wrecked doorway of the cottage in Godric's Hollow, and the first thing he felt, before he saw the bodies, before he saw the crib, before he saw anything at all, was the magic. It hit him like a physical thing, a pressure against his sternum that made him stop walking. He had felt powerful magic before. He had felt Grindelwald's magic once, decades ago, standing close enough to touch him, and it had been like standing near a bonfire, heat you could feel on your skin from 10 feet away. This was not that. This was standing at the bottom of the ocean and feeling somewhere far above, the entire weight of the water pressing down, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to whether you could breathe. It was coming from the crib. He crossed the shattered sitting room slowly, stepping over splinters of wood that had once been a bookshelf, over a child's rattle lying in ash, and he did not let himself look at what was left of James on the stairs, not yet, because there would be time for grief later, and there was not time now for whatever this was. He reached the crib and looked down and saw a baby, just a baby, red-faced and screaming, a thin line of blood tracing down from a fresh cut shaped like lightning above his right eye, and the pressure in the room did not come from the corpse of a Dark Lord's robes crumpled on the floor a few feet away. It came from the child. Dumbledore had spent 60 years learning to read magical signatures the way other men read faces, and what he read in that crib made his hands, which had not shaken in front of another living soul in decades, tremble very slightly as he lifted the boy out. This is not possible, he thought, and then, because he had never been a man to lie to himself for long, this is entirely possible, and that is the problem. He held Harry Potter against his chest and felt the magic in the child settle, infinitesimally, the way a struck bell settles into its hum after the initial crack. But it did not go quiet, and Dumbledore understood, standing in the wreckage of a happy little family's home with a screaming orphan in his arms, that he was holding something that had, in the single act of surviving a killing curse, it had no earthly business surviving. Become the single largest concentration of raw magical potential he had ever encountered in a living human being, larger than Grindelwald's, larger, he suspected, though it made something in his chest go cold to think it, than his own, an infant. Not yet 2 years old, screaming for parents who would never come. Hagrid arrived 20 minutes later on the flying motorbike, huge and weeping, and Dumbledore handed the child over with instructions about privet drive and blood wards and did not tell him, did not tell anyone, not that night and not for 11 years afterward, what he had felt in that crib because he had already decided, standing in the ruins with ash on his shoes, what needed to be done about it. 3 miles beneath the Ministry of Magic, in a chamber with no windows and clocks that ran backward, a young unspeakable named Corvin Ashworth Vane felt something ripple through the ambient wards of the Department of Mysteries at 11 minutes past midnight, and set down his tea so fast it sloshed onto a stack of parchment he'd spent 4 hours annotating. He was 26 years old, sharp-featured, with the kind of stillness that made his colleagues describe him as unnervingly calm in performance reviews meant to be complimentary. He had joined the department because he wanted to understand why magic did what it did, not merely catalog that it did it, and the ripple that passed through the Hall of Prophecy that night felt less like a wave, and more like something enormous turning over in its sleep, very far away, and briefly opening one eye. He spent the next 6 hours combing through every ward log in the building. By dawn, he knew that whatever had caused it traced back to a village in the West Country. By the following week, when the news broke that the Dark Lord had fallen, and a baby named Harry Potter had somehow survived the curse that killed him, Vane understood, with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has just found the first thread of something enormous, that the ripple and the boy were the same event, and that whatever had happened in that cottage was not luck. Luck did not register on ward logs 3 miles underground. He began keeping a private file that night. He would keep adding to it, in secret, for the next 11 years. Back in Godric's Hollow, in the hour after Hagrid had gone, Dumbledore sat alone amid the ruins with a small vial and a length of silver thread spun from his own wand, and did the working slowly, carefully, with the meticulous dread of a surgeon who knows the patient cannot consent to the operation. He did not destroy the magic. He could not have, even had he wished to. It was as much a part of the boy as his blood. What he did was bind it. Wrap it in layer after layer of restraint, tie it down the way one might chain something enormous and sleeping, so it could not wake and thrash and bring the house down before anyone had taught it how to walk. He told himself it was temporary, a scaffold, not a cage, something to be loosened gradually as the boy grew old enough to be taught control, taught wisdom, taught why such power needed careful hands. He told himself a great many things that night, sitting in the ash, and believed every one of them, and the seal took, and the baby stopped screaming, and Albus Dumbledore went home telling himself he had done the responsible thing. He would not think of it again, not truly, not with the weight it deserved, for 10 years. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, was 2 feet by 3 feet by 4 feet high, and Harry Potter learned early that if he curled up exactly right, knees to chest, he could fit without his shoulder pressing against the sloped ceiling where the spiders lived. He was 5 the first time he asked Aunt Petunia why he didn't have a room like Dudley's, and she slammed a frying pan down on the stove hard enough that he flinched back into the cupboard doorway and didn't ask again for 2 years. He was 6 when he broke a plate by accident, dropped it while trying to carry too many dishes at once because Uncle Vernon didn't like asking twice, and something strange happened. The plate didn't shatter on the floor the way plates should. It sort of slowed down, hung in the air for half a second longer than it should have, and came down soft enough that it only cracked instead of breaking into 100 pieces. He didn't understand it. He didn't tell anyone. He'd learned by 6 that strange things happening around him only ever ended with him locked in the cupboard for longer, so he swept up the crack and said nothing and never mentioned it again, though he thought about it sometimes at night, lying in the dark with his knees against his chest, wondering if he'd imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. It was the seal, straining, the first hairline crack in something that had been wound tight around him since before he could remember, flexing under the pressure of a frightened child's instinctive need. He was 7 when his hair, shaved down to nothing by Aunt Petunia the night before school because she said it was getting too long, too much like his father's, grew back completely overnight. He remembered standing in front of the bathroom mirror the next morning, running his hand through it in disbelief, and remembered the specific, sick lurch of fear in his stomach, not wonder, not excitement, fear, because he already knew, with the flat certainty children develop about the rules of their own households, that anything unusual that happened to him was something he would be punished for. He was punished for it. A week in the cupboard, meals through the hatch, and Uncle Vernon's voice, low and furious, informing him that whatever freakishness was in him, he'd have it stamped out one way or another. He was 8 when he ran from Dudley's gang across the school playground, and somehow, impossibly, ended up on the roof of the building, no ladder, no rope, just standing up there looking down at everyone looking up at him in stunned silence. And the fear that came after, the beating, the week of no dinners, Aunt Petunia's shrill insistence to the neighbors that he'd found a ladder somewhere, boys do get up to things, cemented something in him that would take a great deal of unlearning in the years ahead. He learned thoroughly and completely that magic, whatever it was, whatever lived in him and occasionally surged up past whatever held it down, was dangerous. Not dangerous to others. Dangerous to him. He learned to make himself small. He learned to apologize before he'd even done anything wrong, because apologizing first sometimes softened the blow. He learned to eat fast and quietly and to never, ever ask for seconds, and by the time he was 10 years old and small enough that his cousin's hand-me-down clothes hung off him like sailcloth, he had become extremely good at one particular skill, disappearing inside his own life so thoroughly that no one, least of all himself, thought to ask what he might become if nobody ever pushed him back down again. The seal held, mostly. It had been built to hold a child's magic, unconscious and untrained, and mostly it did its job, but 11 years is a long time for anything to strain against its bindings without small, invisible cracks starting to form. And by the time Harry Potter turned 11, there were more of those cracks than Albus Dumbledore, 300 miles away and thinking about a great many other things, had any idea existed. The letter came on his 11th birthday, and then came again, and again, dozens of them, hundreds, chasing him and the Dursleys from the house to a hotel to finally, a broken-down shack on a rock in the middle of a storm-lashed sea. And it was there at midnight, with thunder cracking over black water, that a giant of a man named Hagrid kicked down the door and told an underweight, bruised, bewildered boy that he was a wizard. "I'm a what?" Harry said, and Hagrid laughed, a great booming sound that shook dust from the rafters, and said it again, slower, like he thought Harry might not have heard him the first time. "A wizard, o' course. And a thumpin' good un, I'd say, once ye have had trainin'. With a mum and dad like yours, what else would ye be? And I reckon it's time ye read your letter." Harry took the yellowish envelope with his name written in green ink, Mr. H. Potter, the floor, hut on the rock, the sea, and something in his chest did a strange, cautious flip, the feeling of a door he'd never known existed creaking open a few inches. He read the letter twice, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He looked up at Hagrid, who was watching him with an expression of such fierce, uncomplicated hope that Harry didn't quite know what to do with it. "There's got to be a mistake," Harry said quietly, because 11 years of Petunia and Vernon had taught him bone deep that anything good that arrived addressed to him was a mistake waiting to be corrected. "I can't be a wizard. I'm just Harry." "Just Harry," Hagrid repeated, and something in his big, weathered face went soft and sad for a second. "Harry, do ye know what ye are? Everyone knows what ye are." He didn't, not really, not until Hagrid told him, haltingly, awkwardly, clearly working from a script he'd been given rather than his own words, about James and Lily Potter, about a dark wizard named Voldemort who'd murdered them, about a curse that should have killed a 1-year-old baby and had instead rebounded and destroyed the most feared dark wizard in a century, leaving nothing behind but a scar shaped like lightning and a story that had been told and retold in every wizarding household in Britain for a decade. "I'm famous," Harry said, and it came out strange, disbelieving, because the concept sat so badly against 10 years of being told he was worthless that his brain simply refused to process it as real information. "Famous don't even cover it," Hagrid said. Something happened in Harry's chest as Hagrid talked, something he couldn't name, and if Dumbledore had been standing in that hut with any of the sensitivity he'd shown 11 years before in the ashes of Godric's Hollow, he might have noticed that the boy's magic, dormant, sealed, hairline cracked from a decade of quiet abuse, had shivered once hard at the words, "Your parents didn't die in a car crash, they were murdered, and you survived something no one survives." It was the first time in Harry's life that someone had told him the strange things that happened around him weren't shameful. It was the first time anyone had suggested they might mean something. The seal did not break that night, but it groaned, deep down like ice under too much weight, and somewhere 3 miles beneath the Ministry of Magic Corvin Vane, checking his ward logs out of an old habit he'd never quite abandoned, frowned at a small, strange spike registering from the Bristol Channel, and made a note in a file he'd been keeping quietly for a decade. Diagon Alley hit Harry like a wave of color and noise after 11 years of gray. Hagrid led him past shop windows full of cauldrons and broomsticks and owls, past robed witches haggling over dragon liver, and Harry walked through all of it with his mouth slightly open, trying to catalog a world that had apparently been hiding in plain sight his entire miserable life. Gringotts was cold marble and goblins with sharp teeth and a cartridge into the earth that left his stomach somewhere behind him, and at the bottom of it was a vault, his vault, Hagrid said, left to him by his parents, stacked floor to ceiling with gold that made Harry's head spin. He'd spent 11 years being told he was a burden, an expense, a freak who ought to be grateful for the cupboard he was given. He stood in front of that vault and felt something crack a little further, quietly, in the part of him that had learned to expect nothing. Madame Malkins fitted him for robes while a pale, pointed-faced boy in the next chair talked without pause about Quidditch and blood purity, and how his father said mudbloods shouldn't even be allowed in. And Harry, new to all of it, unsure of the rules, still functionally a stranger to his own history, mostly just nodded along and said as little as possible, the old privet drive instinct to stay small and unnoticed kicking in automatically even here. But it was Ollivanders, at the end of a long day, that mattered most. The shop was narrow and dusty and smelled like old parchment, and Mr. Ollivander himself was a wisp of a man with wide, pale eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever he looked at. He measured Harry with a tape that moved on its own, muttering to itself, and then began pulling boxes down from shelves that reached impossibly high, handing Harry wand after wand to wave. Nothing worked. A birch and unicorn hair wand made the shelf behind them collapse. A maple and phoenix feather set fire to a rug, a small fire, quickly smothered, but Ollivander's eyebrows had gone up sharply at that, watching Harry's face rather than the flames. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to Harry after the fourth failed wand. "Curious indeed." "Sorry," Harry said immediately, the word leaping out before he'd even decided to say it, the old reflex, apologize first, apologize always, and Ollivander's strange pale eyes flicked to him with something sharp and assessing in them. "Whatever for Mr. Potter. You've broken nothing that can't be repaired, and destroyed no rug that didn't deserve a good singeing regardless." He said it lightly, but he was still watching Harry's face very closely, the way a man watches a pot he suspects is about to boil over. "No, number I think, yes, I wonder." He disappeared into the back of the shop and returned a long minute later with a slim box, older looking than the others, and inside it lay a wand of holly, 11 inches, with something pale gleaming faintly along its length. "Try this one," Ollivander said, and his voice had gone quiet. Harry took it, and the moment his fingers closed around the handle, warmth flooded up his arm and into his chest, and every window in the shop rattled at once, and a cascade of gold and red sparks burst from the tip like a small firework going off in the cramped little room. Harry gasped, not in pain, in something closer to relief, the specific relief of a held breath finally let out, and for 1/2 second, standing there with sparks fizzing around him, he felt more like himself than he had in 11 years of living. Ollivander did not clap, did not smile the easy congratulatory smile he'd apparently given his last dozen customers. He stood very still, watching the sparks fade, and said, curious, a third time, so softly Harry almost didn't catch it. "Sorry, is something wrong with it?" Harry asked. "Nothing at all wrong with it, Mr. Potter. It's a very fine wand. It's simply—" Ollivander paused, choosing his words with the care of a man diffusing something. "The wand chooses the wizard, as I'm sure you've been told, or will be. This wand's brother, why, its very twin, in fact, same phoenix, same core, gave you that scar." He gestured at Harry's forehead without quite meeting his eyes. "I think we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. After all, he who must not be named did great things, terrible, yes, but great." Harry didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and paid 7 gold galleons for the wand, and left the shop with Hagrid making cheerful small talk that Harry only half heard, because some part of him was turning Ollivander's words over and over, wondering, for the first time in his life, what great things might feel like for someone who wasn't used to being allowed to want anything at all. What neither of them noticed, what no one in Diagon Alley noticed, was the way the wand had reacted, not merely with the ordinary flare of a match struck between core and caster, but with something underneath that, a brief, deep resonance like a second, larger note ringing beneath the first. Ollivander had felt it, he hadn't understood it, he would think about it, on and off, for years. King's Cross Station on the 1st of September was chaos. Trolleys, families, a wall between platforms 9 and 10 that Harry walked through at a dead run with his eyes screwed shut, half convinced he was about to break his nose on solid brick, and then didn't, and opened his eyes to a scarlet steam engine, and a platform crowded with witches and wizards of every shape and size, all funneling toward the Hogwarts Express. He found an empty compartment, and sat with his trunk and his new owl, Hedwig, rattling gently in her cage, and stared out the window at Mrs. Weasley fussing over a gaggle of red-headed children on the platform, feeling the particular loneliness of someone who has never once been fussed over by anybody. The door slid open a few minutes later, and a boy about his own age, tall and gangly with the same flame-red hair as the family on the platform, poked his head in. "Mind if I sit here?" "Everywhere else is full." "No, go ahead," Harry said, and something in him relaxed slightly at having someone to talk to, even a stranger. The boy's name was Ron Weasley, and within 10 minutes Harry had learned that Ron had 5 older brothers, one at Hogwarts already sorted into Gryffindor, 2 more currently causing chaos further up the train, and a huge family reputation to live up to that he clearly found exhausting even to describe. Ron talked easily, without much filter, the way people talk who have never had to worry that a wrong word might get them locked in a cupboard, and Harry found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, answering questions about his own life carefully, a little guardedly, until Ron's eyes went wide and fixed on his forehead. "Blimey, are you, what?" Harry said, though he already knew. "You're Harry Potter," Ron breathed, and Harry felt the old cupboard instinct rear up, apologize, deflect, make yourself small, but something else pushed back against it too, something new, something that had been slowly loosening since the moment sparks had flown from a holly wand in a dusty little shop. "Yeah," Harry said simply, "that's me." They talked the rest of the ride about Quidditch, which Harry knew nothing about, and Ron was delighted to explain at exhausting length, about the sorting, which apparently involved some sort of test that terrified Ron more than he wanted to admit, about Ron's rat scabbers, who Harry privately thought looked distinctly unwell for a pet. A round-faced boy named Neville came looking for a lost toad at one point, trailed a few minutes later by a bushy-haired girl named Hermione Granger, who spoke in complete, slightly bossy paragraphs about spells she'd already memorized from her coursebooks, and left as abruptly as she'd arrived, unimpressed that neither boy had bothered to practice any of them yet. It was good. It was, Harry thought, watching the countryside blur past the window, possibly the best afternoon of his entire life, right up until the compartment door slid open one more time, late in the journey, and the pale, pointed-faced boy from Madame Malkin's stepped in flanked by 2 enormous, dull-eyed boys who looked like they'd been hired for their shoulders rather than their conversation. "Is it true?" the boy said, looking straight at Harry with an expression that managed to be both curious and faintly contemptuous at once. "They're saying all down the train that Harry Potter's in this compartment. So it's you, is it?" "Yes," Harry said. The boy's eyes flicked to Ron, took in the hand-me-down robes, the old wand, the general air of a family that didn't have much, and something in his expression sharpened with an ugly kind of satisfaction. You'll soon find out that some wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there. He held out a hand, pale and manicured, and did not look at Ron at all when he said it, though the insult was clearly meant for both of them to hear. Harry looked at the offered hand. He thought with a clarity that surprised him, because clarity of any kind was still new to him. About every time Dudley Dursley had offered him something that turned out to be a trap, every time being helped by someone bigger and louder had actually meant being controlled. He thought about Ron, who'd shared his sweets an hour ago without being asked, who talked for 20 minutes about his family with the easy warmth of someone who actually loved them. I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself, thanks, Harry said. The boy's face went cold. I'd be careful if I were you, Potter. Unless you're a bit politer, you'll go the same way as your parents. They didn't know what was good for them either. He said it lightly, almost bored, the way boys who have never once feared consequences say cruel things, and something in Harry, something that had spent 11 years being told his existence was a mistake, and had in the last 6 hours started to suspect that might not be true, went very still and very cold. He didn't decide to do it. That was the thing he'd remember later, trying to piece together exactly what happened. There was no moment where he thought, I will make this happen. There was only the boy's sneering mouth, the word parents delivered like an insult, and then a sensation like something enormous shifting position deep inside his chest. A pressure he'd never felt before, not quite pain, not quite anything he had a name for, and every window in the compartment blew wide open at once with a crack like a gunshot, wind tearing through the carriage hard enough to send parchment and sweet wrappers flying, and the light bulb overhead shattered in a shower of sparks. And the pale boy staggered backward into his two hulking friends, so hard all three of them went down in a tangle of limbs on the corridor floor outside. For one long, ringing second, nobody moved. Ron's mouth was hanging open. Hedwig was shrieking and beating her wings against her cage. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was calling out asking what on earth that noise had been. Harry stood very still, breathing hard, his hand pressed flat against his own chest without quite meaning to put it there, feeling his heart slamming against his ribs, and underneath that, deeper than that, something else. A hum. A low, vast, patient hum, like the sound the sea makes if you press a shell to your ear, except this shell was somewhere behind his sternum and the sea it was echoing was enormous. And for just a moment, standing amid broken glass and howling wind of his own making, Harry Potter felt the very edge of something that had been locked away from him his entire life, and it did not feel like a mistake at all. It felt like a door, cracked open an inch, with light coming through from the other side. Then it was gone, folded back down, shoved back under whatever held it, the wind dying, the broken light bulb's glass tinkling softly to the floor, and Harry was just an 11-year-old boy standing in a train compartment full of frightened people, staring at his own shaking hands. The pale boy scrambled up off the corridor floor, robes askew, dignity considerably more damaged than his body, and stared at Harry with something that had shifted, in the space of 3 seconds, from contempt to open, wide-eyed wariness. "What did you do?" he demanded, voice pitched higher than he probably intended. "I don't know," Harry said honestly, and it was true. He genuinely, entirely did not know, though some new and unfamiliar part of him noted quietly that he hadn't been afraid of the boy at all, not for one single second, even before whatever that was had happened. "But I'd get up and leave if I were you." The boy left. He didn't say anything else. His two friends helped him up, and the three of them retreated back down the corridor at a pace just short of a run, and Ron let out a long, shaky breath and turned to stare at Harry with an expression somewhere between terror and absolute delight. "Bloody hell," Ron said. "Did you mean to do that?" "No," Harry said again and sat back down slowly, still feeling the after-tremor of it in his hands. "I don't even know what I did. You blew out every window on the whole compartment, mate. That's not nothing. That's not accidental magic either. My brother Charlie set fire to the curtains once when he was a kid, but he didn't take out a whole train carriage." Ron sounded almost reverent about it, which Harry found he didn't quite know how to respond to. That was Malfoy, by the way. Draco Malfoy. His whole family's Death Eaters, or near enough, everyone knows it, they just never got caught. Bet he's going straight to tell his dad you're dangerous. Dangerous. The word landed strangely in Harry's chest, not as an accusation, the way it always had at Privet Drive, but almost as information, almost as something he might want to know more about. He didn't sleep much that night, lying in his bunk as the train rattled north through darkening countryside, listening to Ron's soft snoring from the bunk below and turning the last hour over and over in his mind. 11 years, he thought, of being told that the strange things that happened around him were shameful, dangerous, his own fault, a defect to be beaten out of him. 11 years of making himself smaller, quieter, less visible, because visibility had always ended badly. And then 5 minutes with someone talking down to Ron and calling his dead parents fools, and something in him had simply answered. Not with fear. Not with the flinch he'd trained into every muscle of his body since before he could properly remember. With power, immediate and physical and entirely his own, and afterward he had not felt ashamed of it at all. He didn't understand what had happened to him in that compartment, and he wouldn't understand it, not fully, not for months yet, but lying in the dark with the train clacking on toward Hogwarts, Harry Potter understood one thing very clearly for the first time in his life. Whatever lived inside him, whatever had cracked those windows and sent Draco Malfoy scrambling backward with real fear on his pointed little face, it was not small, and it was not something to be ashamed of, and some part of him, some old, buried, 11-year silenced part, had liked, very much, not having to be afraid. 300 miles south, in a quiet office lined with silver instruments that ticked and hummed on their own, Albus Dumbledore sat late into the night with a small brass device shaped like a compass, its single needle usually pointed fixed and steady toward a particular point on a particular map, the Dursleys' house on Privet Drive, unmoving for a decade, and frowned as the needle jittered once sharply, sometime around 6 o'clock in the evening, before settling again. He made a note of it. He told himself it was nothing, residual accidental magic, the ordinary flaring of an untrained child under stress, nothing the seal couldn't absorb. He was wrong about that, though it would be some time yet before he let himself admit it. Chapter 2. First cracks. The boats crossed the lake in near-total darkness, black water lapping soft against the wood, and Harry sat with his knees drawn up watching Hogwarts rise out of the mist ahead of them, towers and turrets catching the last violet light of dusk, windows glowing gold, the whole castle looking less like a building and more like something that had grown there slowly over 1,000 years and simply decided to keep growing. "Blimey," Ron said beside him, for possibly the 10th time that evening, and for once Harry couldn't disagree with the sentiment even if the word itself was wearing thin. Hagrid's lantern bobbed at the front of the flotilla, and somewhere behind them Hermione was already reciting facts about the castle's founding to a boy who hadn't asked and clearly wasn't going to get a word in regardless. Harry let the sound of it wash past him and kept his eyes on the castle, feeling something settle in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, not quite peace, not quite excitement, something closer to the specific, cautious hope of a person who has learned not to trust good things but wants badly to be wrong about that instinct just this once. The boat scraped up onto a pebbled shore beneath the castle walls, and Hagrid herded the whole nervous, dripping mass of first-years up a flight of stone steps to a pair of huge oak doors, where a tall witch in emerald robes and a severe, straight-backed bearing was waiting for them. "The first-year's Professor McGonagall," Hagrid announced, sounding faintly proud, as if he'd personally rode them all across himself. "Thank you, Hagrid, I will take them from here." McGonagall's eyes swept across the gathered children with the brisk efficiency of someone taking inventory, and Harry had the distinct impression, even in that first glance, that very little escaped her notice. Her gaze paused on him for perhaps half a second longer than it did on anyone else, there and gone, unreadable, before she turned and led them through the doors into an entrance hall so vast it swallowed the sound of 40 pairs of nervous, shuffling feet. She gave them the standard speech about houses and points and behaving themselves, and then left them waiting in a small chamber off the entrance hall while she went to check the great hall was ready, and it was there, crowded in among strangers, that Harry heard someone hiss his name. Potter. Draco Malfoy had pushed his way to the front of the huddle, flanked by the same 2 enormous boys from the train, and though his voice was pitched low, several nearby first-years turned to look. "Word's already going round about what happened on the train. You want to be careful who you make an enemy of." "I'm not looking to make enemies of anyone," Harry said evenly. "You started it, if you remember." "I remember you blowing out windows because you didn't like being told something," Malfoy said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there on the train, not quite fear, but caution, the wary respect of someone recalculating an equation. "That's not nothing, Potter. People are going to want to know what you can do." "Then they can ask," Harry said, instead of hissing at me in corners, and turned away before Malfoy could answer, and if his heart was beating a little faster than it should have been, at least this time it wasn't from fear. McGonagall returned and led them through the great double doors into the hall itself, and Harry forgot Malfoy entirely, because the ceiling overhead had vanished into a velvet black sky scattered with stars, and 4 long tables stretched the length of the room packed with older students all turning to stare. And at the front, on a raised dais, a battered old hat sat on a wooden stool looking entirely unremarkable, except for the fact that it had, a moment ago, apparently sung a full song about the founding of the 4 houses, which several older students were still chuckling about. McGonagall unrolled a long scroll of names and called them out one by one, and the hat, when placed on each nervous head, took anywhere from a few seconds to a full minute before shouting out a house, and the students filed off to their tables amid applause and cheers, and Harry watched all of it with his stomach twisting tighter and tighter, because eventually she was going to call his name, and every single person in that hall was going to look Potter Harry. The whisper that ran through the hall was audible even from the front. Harry walked up, feeling 400 pairs of eyes on him, and sat on the stool, and McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head, and the world went dark and quiet inside the brim. Said a voice, dry and thoughtful, right inside his own skull, and Harry startled hard enough that his hands gripped the edges of the stool. Difficult, very difficult indeed. Plenty of courage, I see, and not a little talent, oh my yes, a nice thirst to prove yourself, and hold on. The voice stopped. Harry felt it, felt something, some invisible sensation, pressing gently against the inside of his own head, the way a hand might press against a closed door to see if it moved. Well now, the hat said, and its tone had changed, gone careful in a way it hadn't been a second before. That's peculiar. That is exceedingly peculiar. There's a great deal more of you than there ought to be, young man, and most of it is, bound. Someone's tied a very careful knot around something very large in here, and I confess I've never quite felt the like of it in 1100 years of sorting. Harry's throat went dry. What do you mean? He thought, as clearly as he could manage. Bound how? By who? That, the hat said, is rather beyond my purview to say. I do not diagnose, and whatever's been done to you is old work, old and deep and deliberately quiet, the kind of magic that doesn't want to be noticed even by things designed to notice magic. I'll say only this, whoever did it was either very wise or very frightened, and I find on reflection that I cannot easily tell which. Can you take it off? Harry thought, urgent now, something in him lunging toward the question the way a starving man lunges toward food. Whatever it is, can you undo it? No, the hat said, not unkindly. That is not remotely within my power, and even if it were, I should not do it without understanding what I was undoing first. But I will tell you this, Harry Potter, and I do not say it lightly. Whatever is under that binding is going to matter a very great deal someday to a great many people, and when the day comes that it starts coming loose, I would not wish to be standing between you and whoever put it there. A pause, considering, now, where to put you. Slytherin would serve you well, there's cunning in there, and no small ambition, whatever you may think of the house's reputation. But no, I think not. You've had quite enough of being contained for one lifetime. Gryffindor. The last word rang out loud across the hall, and the Gryffindor table exploded into cheers, and Harry stumbled off the stool with his head spinning from everything the hat had just told him, barely hearing McGonagall's congratulations, barely seeing Ron pounding him on the back as he sat down at the table amid a sea of red and gold. Bound. Someone's tied a very careful knot around something very large. He sat through the rest of the sorting. Hermione went to Gryffindor a few names later, bouncing with visible relief, and Ron followed soon after to raucous cheers from what appeared to be half his family already seated at the table, and Malfoy went to Slytherin exactly as everyone had expected, and none of it fully registered, because Harry's mind kept circling back to the same handful of words. Someone did this to me, on purpose, and they never told me. He looked without quite meaning to, up toward the staff table, where an old man with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles was watching the sorting with a benevolent smile that reached, apparently, everyone in the room except Harry, whose gaze he did not meet at all. He didn't tell Ron about the hat's warning that night, or the next day, or for weeks afterward. It wasn't that he distrusted Ron, quite the opposite. Ron had become, with startling speed, the first real friend Harry had ever had, but the words felt too large and too frightening to say out loud yet, like admitting them to another person might make them more true, more permanent, more real than he was ready for. So he carried them privately, turning them over at odd moments, during breakfast, during the long, echoing walk to Charms, lying awake in his four-poster in Gryffindor Tower listening to Neville snore, and slowly, without quite noticing it happening, they stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like something closer to a question he intended, eventually, to get an answer to. Classes started properly the next morning, and Hogwarts turned out to be exactly as strange and wonderful as Harry had hoped, in ways both large and small, moving staircases that led somewhere different on Fridays. A poltergeist named Peeves who dropped water balloons on unsuspecting first-years from a great height and cackled about it for hours afterward. Herbology with squat, cheerful Professor Sprout, who let them handle plants that hissed and snapped and occasionally spat something foul-smelling if provoked. Transfiguration with McGonagall, precise and demanding, who turned her desk into a pig and back again on the first day without a word of explanation, purely, Harry suspected, to make certain everyone understood exactly what they were meant to be working toward. And then there was potions in the dungeons with Professor Snape. Snape had sallow skin and greasy black hair and eyes so dark they looked almost like holes, and from the moment he swept into the classroom, black robes billowing, and began the register in a voice pitched to silence, Harry understood he had made an enemy without doing anything at all to earn it. "Ah yes," Snape said, pausing on Harry's name, and something flickered across his face too fast for Harry to read, there and gone before Harry could name it. "Harry Potter, our new celebrity." The class laughed, a nervous, obliging titter, and Snape's dark eyes settled on Harry with an intensity that felt less like a teacher assessing a student, and more like a man examining something he found personally distasteful. "Let me see if I can teach you something before you fail to listen, Potter," Snape said, and launched into a rapid-fire volley of questions Harry had no way of knowing the answers to: asphodel and wormhood, the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane, his voice dripping with a contempt that seemed to have been prepared and rehearsed well in advance of ever meeting him. Hermione's hand shot into the air each time, straining upward, desperate to answer, and Snape ignored her completely, apparently more interested in watching Harry fail than in anyone actually learning anything. "I don't know, sir," Harry said the third time, keeping his voice level even as heat crept up the back of his neck. "Pity," Snape said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but, clearly fame isn't everything. He deducted no points, gave no detention. There was nothing, technically, for Harry to object to, but Harry sat through the rest of the lesson with his jaw tight, mixing a potion that turned the wrong shade of green twice before he got it right, aware the whole time of Snape's black eyes flicking toward him at odd, unpredictable intervals, the way a man watches something he suspects without proof of being dangerous. Afterward, walking up the dungeon stairs into daylight, Ron voiced what Harry had been thinking. "He hates you, properly hates you, what you ever do to him. I've known him for one lesson," Harry said. "I haven't had time to do anything. Fred and George reckon he's always been like that with everyone. But that," Ron shook his head, "that was different. That was personal, that was." Harry thought about it for the rest of the day off and on, and reached no satisfying conclusion, and filed it away alongside the hat's warning in the growing collection of things about his own life that he did not understand and strongly suspected somebody, somewhere, could explain if they were ever honest with him. It was 2 days later, ducking into the wrong corridor after charms while looking for a shortcut, that Harry got his first real look at Professor Quirrell's classroom, and the first proper look at the man himself since the welcoming feast, where he'd noticed, mostly, the turban and the stammer and precious little else. Quirrell taught defense against the dark arts in a room that smelled faintly of garlic, for reasons nobody would explain, and the lesson Harry sat through that afternoon was thin and nervous and largely useless, Quirrell's voice trembling through half-finished sentences about hags and boggarts while he flinched, visibly, at his own shadow whenever it crossed the window. It wasn't the stammering that struck Harry as strange. It was something underneath it, a wrongness he couldn't name, a faint, persistent unease that settled over him the moment he stepped into that classroom and didn't lift until he'd left it again. He mentioned it to Ron over dinner that evening, tentatively expecting to be laughed at. "Something's off about him," Harry said, pushing mashed potato around his plate. "Not just the stutter, something else. I don't know how to explain it." "He's terrified of his own classroom," Ron said through a mouthful of chicken. "Reckon he had some sort of run-in on his travels and never recovered. Fred says he met a vampire in the Black Forest and it put him off garlic for life, ironically, given he still stinks of the stuff." "Maybe," Harry said, unconvinced, and looked down the staff table to where Quirrell was hunched over his plate, purple turban slightly askew, sweat beading on his forehead even though the great hall wasn't especially warm. Beside him, Snape was watching Quirrell with an expression of flat, unreadable calculation, and for one strange, fleeting moment their eyes met, Snape's and Quirrell's, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with dinner conversation at all. Harry didn't understand what he'd seen. He filed it away too, on top of the pile, and went back to his potatoes, and didn't think about it again for weeks, not until a night in October when the whole castle would need reminding, all at once, exactly how much lived under the surface of things nobody bothered to examine too closely. Flying lessons started the following week on the wide green lawn behind the castle. 40 first-years lined up beside broomsticks with Madame Hooch pacing along the row barking instructions. And Harry, who had never in his life been on a broom, never mind flown one, found to his own considerable surprise that his hand had barely finished saying "up" before the broom leapt into his palm as though it had been waiting for him personally. "Well, that's unusual," Madame Hooch remarked, moving on down the line where most students were still coaxing reluctant broomsticks off the grass, Ron's included, which rolled over sullenly twice before finally cooperating. Harry didn't think much of it at the time, one small good thing among a dozen small strange things that had happened since he'd arrived at Hogwarts, but he noticed, mounting the broom and kicking off at Madame Hooch's whistle, that flying felt less like learning something new and more like remembering something he'd simply forgotten he already knew how to do. The broom answered to the barest shift of his weight. He banked, hovered, corrected course, all with an ease that had nothing to do with the awkward, overcorrected wobbling happening all around him on the lawn below. It was Neville, badly panicked and rising far too fast on a broom he clearly hadn't meant to lose control of, who ended the lesson early, soaring 20 feet, then 30, then plummeting when the broom bucked beneath him and he lost his grip, landing with a sickening crack that broke his wrist and sent Madame Hooch sprinting across the lawn to usher him off to the infirmary, shouting over her shoulder that nobody was to so much as touch a broomstick while she was gone. Malfoy, predictably, waited exactly as long as it took Madame Hooch to disappear around the corner of the castle before sauntering over to where Neville's remembrall, a small glass ball he'd received from his grandmother that morning, glowing red whenever its owner forgot something, had rolled into the grass and picked it up, turning it over in his hand with a slow, deliberate smile. "Look at this," he said, loud enough to carry. "Longbottom's silly toy. I think I'll leave it somewhere he'll have to climb a tree for it. Give it here, Malfoy," Harry said, and it wasn't a request. Or what, Potter? Going to blow out another window? Malfoy's grin widened, though there was something careful underneath it, a wariness he hadn't quite managed to shake since the train. "I'll put it up here somewhere Longbottom can find it." He mounted his own broom and kicked off, rising 20 feet into the air with the remembrall clutched in one hand, grinning down at the small crowd that had gathered. Harry didn't think about it. He mounted his broom and kicked off after him, and Ron shouted something behind him about Madame Hooch's instructions that Harry entirely ignored, and within seconds he understood, with the same wordless certainty that had let him fly the first time, exactly how to close the distance. "Catch it then if you're so clever," Malfoy called, and hurled the little glass ball hard across the empty air toward the castle wall, clearly expecting it to shatter, clearly expecting Harry to be too slow or too inexperienced to reach it. Harry leaned forward and the broom answered like an extension of his own body, and the ground blurred beneath him, and he caught the remembrall 6 inches from the stone wall and pulled up hard, hovering there for one long second in front of a dozen open-mouthed first-years, before landing lightly on the grass and holding the little glass ball out toward Neville, who took it back with shaking hands and an expression of pure disbelief. "That," said a stern voice from behind them all, "was either the most reckless thing I have seen a first-year do in this job, or the single most natural flying talent I've witnessed in years, Mr. Potter, and I confess I am having difficulty deciding which." Professor McGonagall had appeared, apparently drawn by the commotion, and her sharp eyes moved between Harry, the broom, and the little crowd of students with an expression that Harry couldn't quite read, not anger, not exactly, though there was a warning note in her voice that made it clear she wasn't pleased about the rule-breaking regardless of how it had ended. "Come with me, Mr. Potter," she said, and Harry's stomach dropped, certain he was about to be expelled on his second week at school, and followed her in silence into the castle, up flights of stairs, expecting the worst the entire way, right up until she stopped outside a classroom, put her head in, and emerged a moment later with the Gryffindor Quidditch captain in tow. "Wood," she said, "I've found you a seeker." Halloween arrived with pumpkins the size of small houses hollowed out and floating along the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, and bats swooping between them, and a feast so lavish it briefly made Harry forget, entirely, everything strange that had happened since September, the hat's warning, Snape's contempt, Quirrell's wrongness, all of it set aside for one evening in favor of roast chicken and pumpkin juice and easy laughter with Ron beside him. It was Quirrell who broke the mood, bursting into the hall at a dead run midway through the meal, turban askew, robes flapping, shouting the 2 words that emptied every color from 400 faces at once. "Troll in the dungeons, thought you ought to know." He got the words out and then collapsed, apparently overcome, right there on the floor, and the hall erupted into shrieking chaos that Dumbledore silenced with a single cannon blast crack from his wand, standing calmly at the staff table while students screamed and scrambled. Prefects will lead their houses back to their dormitories immediately, Dumbledore instructed, his voice carrying easily over the noise without needing to be raised. Teachers, please follow me to the dungeons. The Gryffindors filed out in a tight, nervous huddle behind Percy Weasley, who had suddenly discovered, with his first-ever crisis to manage, exactly how much he enjoyed telling people what to do, and it was somewhere in that crush of moving bodies that Ron turned to Harry with a stricken expression. "Hermione," he said. "She doesn't know. She's been crying in the girls' bathroom all evening, didn't come to the feast, remember. She doesn't know about the troll." Harry remembered vaguely an argument earlier that day. Ron had said something careless and unkind about Hermione within her earshot, not meaning her to hear it, and she'd fled in tears, and neither of them had seen her since. Harry looked at Ron's face, guilt written plainly across it, and made a decision he didn't spend long deliberating. "We have to go get her." They peeled off from the main group without anyone noticing, ducking down a side corridor and doubling back toward the girls' bathroom Hermione had supposedly been hiding in, and it was in that corridor, dim and empty and smelling faintly of dust, that they heard it. A low, grunting shuffle, heavy and wrong, footsteps that made the floor itself tremble slightly with each impact. They turned a corner and there it was, a troll 12 feet of gray lumpen muscle, carrying a wooden club as long as Harry was tall, its small eyes dull and stupid above a face like a badly carved boulder. It hadn't seen them yet. It shuffled onward, sniffing at the air, and Harry grabbed Ron's sleeve and pulled him back around the corner before the troll's attention could land on either of them. "It's heading for a bathroom," Ron whispered, eyes wide with horror. "Harry, it's heading for the bathroom." They ran. There was no discussion about it, no plan beyond the single, screaming certainty that Hermione was inside that room and the troll was moving toward the door. They burst through it a few seconds after the troll itself, and the scene that met them was one Harry would remember with perfect, terrible clarity for the rest of his life. Hermione backed against the far wall between two rows of sinks, white-faced, frozen, the troll looming over her with its club raised, and no time at all to think about what came next. Ron threw a tap at it. It bounced off the troll's shoulder, and did absolutely nothing except turn its dim attention briefly away from Hermione and toward the two boys who'd just arrived, which at least bought a second of time, though not nearly enough of one, because the troll swung its club sideways and Ron dove clear and Hermione screamed, and the club came down against the sinks hard enough to shatter porcelain across the tiled floor. And something in Harry, something that had been coiled tight and quiet and waiting since a train compartment full of shattered glass, since a sorting hat's warning about a knot tied around something too large to safely hold, simply let go. He didn't decide it. There was no moment of choice, no calculation, nothing that felt like control at all, only the troll raising its club a second time above Hermione's head, and a pressure building behind Harry's ribs like a held breath finally releasing after 11 years of being told to keep it in, and then a wave of force tore out of him that picked the troll clean off its feet and threw it bodily into the far wall hard enough to crack stone. The bathroom lights burst overhead in a shower of sparks. Water erupted from every tap and burst pipe at once, flooding the floor ankle-deep in seconds. The mirrors along the wall cracked, spidering out from their centers, and for one impossible, endless second, the whole room seemed to hum with a low, physical pressure that made the hair on Ron's arms stand straight up where he lay sprawled on the wet floor, staring at Harry with an expression of pure, undiluted shock. The troll slid down the cracked wall, unconscious, its club rolling out of its slack grip across the flooded tiles, and Harry stood in the middle of the wrecked bathroom with his chest heaving, water soaking through his robes, feeling something enormous receding back down inside him the way a wave recedes off a beach, leaving him shaking and hollowed out and underneath the shock, strangely, fiercely alive in a way he had never once felt in 11 years at Privet Drive. "Harry." Hermione's voice, small and trembling, cut through the ringing in his ears. She was still pressed against the wall, staring at him, not at the troll, not at the wreckage, but at him with an expression that had shifted in the space of a few seconds from terror to something closer to awe. "Harry, how did you?" "I don't know," Harry said, and it was the truth, though it felt less frightening to say out loud than it had on the train. "I don't know, but I'd rather that than let it hit you." Footsteps came pounding down the corridor a moment later, and Professor McGonagall burst through the door with Snape and Quirrell close behind her, and the three of them stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene. A fully grown mountain troll unconscious against a cracked wall, water sheeting across the floor, every mirror in the room shattered, and 3 first-years standing in the middle of it, soaked and shaking but entirely, unmistakably alive. "Explain," McGonagall said, in a voice like a whip crack, "immediately what has happened here." It was Hermione, to Harry's considerable surprise, who spoke first, chin lifting, voice steadying with every word, clearly lying through her teeth for the first time in her academic life. "It's my fault, Professor. I read about trolls and thought I could handle it myself. I went looking for it, and Harry and Ron came to save me. If they hadn't found me, I'd probably be dead." McGonagall's eyes narrowed, moving between Hermione's determined face and the wreckage around them, and Harry got the strong impression she didn't believe a single word of it, but she let it stand, deducting 5 points from Gryffindor for Hermione's carelessness and awarding, in the very next breath, 5 points each to Harry and Ron for what she called sheer dumb luck in dealing with a fully grown troll, and then she turned her attention to the troll itself, and to the wreckage of the bathroom. And something in her expression shifted from stern disapproval into something far more careful. "Mr. Potter," she said slowly, "how precisely did you render this troll unconscious?" "I don't know, Professor, I just reacted. There wasn't time to think. You did not use your wand. It wasn't a question." McGonagall had clearly already noted that Harry's wand was still tucked, unused, in his robes. "No, Professor." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, studying the 12-foot troll slumped against a wall that had visibly cracked under the force of an impact no ordinary 11-year-old should have been able to deliver, and something crossed her face that Harry couldn't quite name, not disbelief exactly. Recognition of something she'd have preferred not to recognize. "Go back to your common room," she said finally. "All three of you, I will deal with matters here." They walked back through the castle in near total silence, dripping and shaken, and it was only once they were safely inside the portrait hole and huddled by the fire, Gryffindor Tower emptied out around them as everyone else had already gone to bed, that Ron finally found his voice again. "Harry," he said, staring into the flames rather than at Harry directly, "that wasn't accidental magic. My brother Charlie set curtains on fire when he was little. That's accidental magic. What you just did, you threw a troll, without a wand, across a room." "I know," Harry said quietly, and found to his own surprise that he wasn't frightened by the admission. "I don't know what it was. But I don't think it's the first time it's happened, and I don't think it'll be the last." Hermione, curled in the armchair opposite with a blanket someone had thrust into her hands, was watching him with an expression that had settled, finally, into something steady and thoughtful. "You should ask someone," she said. "A teacher, Dumbledore maybe. If something like that is happening to you, there might be a reason, and it might be important you understand it before it happens again, somewhere more dangerous than a bathroom." Harry thought about the Sorting Hat's voice in his head, bound, someone's tied a very careful knot, and about Dumbledore's eyes, sliding past him at the feast the night of the sorting, never quite meeting his gaze, and something cold and certain settled in his chest. "I don't think Dumbledore would tell me anything I don't already sort of know," he said slowly, choosing the words with more care than he usually bothered with. "But I'm going to find out anyway, one way or another." McGonagall found Dumbledore in his office late that night, climbing the spiral staircase past the stone gargoyle, with a face set in the particular grim expression that meant she had news she did not enjoy delivering. "Albus," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her, "I need to tell you what happened in the girls' bathroom this evening, and I would appreciate it if you did not simply nod along and tell me it was nothing to be concerned about, because I do not believe that, and I do not think you will either once you've heard the details." Dumbledore set down his cup of tea and gestured her toward a chair, and listened without interruption as she described the scene, the troll thrown bodily into a wall hard enough to crack stone, every mirror in the room shattered, water bursting from pipes that hadn't been touched, and at the center of it, an 11-year-old boy who hadn't so much as drawn his wand. "He did all of that wandlessly," McGonagall finished. "Albus, I have taught this subject for over 30 years. I have never seen accidental magic on that scale from a child that age, not once, and I do not believe what I witnessed tonight was ordinary accidental magic at all. Something in that boy is far, far beyond what any first year ought to be capable of, and I think you know more about why than you are currently telling me." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes, usually so bright and amused, gone distant and troubled behind his spectacles. "I do know more, Minerva," he said finally, very carefully, "and I promise you when the time is right I will explain it fully to you and to him. But the time is not yet right, and I would ask you to trust that judgment a little longer." McGonagall's mouth thinned into a hard, unhappy line. "With respect, Albus, that boy nearly killed a troll with his bare hands tonight because a wand wasn't fast enough. I do not know how much longer not yet can reasonably hold. She left without waiting for an answer, and Dumbledore sat alone in his office a long while afterward, staring at the little brass compass on his desk. Its needle no longer pointed at Privet Drive but here, at Hogwarts, steady and unmoving, and yet he noted with a small, cold flicker of unease he did not enjoy examining too closely. The needle had trembled twice that evening before settling, exactly as it had trembled once before on a train heading north a few weeks prior. He told himself again that there was time. He was beginning, for the first time in a decade, to genuinely doubt it. The report of a mountain troll breaching Hogwarts wards on Halloween night reached the Department of Magical Law Enforcement within hours. Filed as a routine incident, trolls occasionally wandered where they shouldn't, and the matter was resolved without loss of life. Filed, closed, forgotten by everyone whose job it was to care about such things. Everyone except one. Corvin Vane read the incident report 3 days later. Buried in a stack of unrelated ministry paperwork he reviewed out of habit rather than duty, and nearly missed it entirely. A single line, almost an afterthought, noting that the troll had apparently been subdued by students prior to staff arrival, with no further detail offered because no further detail had seemed necessary to whoever filed it. He sat very still at his desk for a long moment after reading it, and then pulled open the bottom drawer where he kept a thin, private file that had grown slowly over 11 years, and added a single new line to a page that already contained a dozen others. A school photograph clipped from the Daily Prophet's coverage of that year's new Hogwarts intake, a boy with untidy black hair and a lightning bolt scar, and beneath it, in Vane's own small, careful handwriting. Godric's Hollow, Oct. 1981, Ward Ripple, unprecedented magnitude. Diagon Alley, Wand Selection, Ollivander's Private Notes, unusual resonance, unconfirmed, second hand. King's Cross Platform, unexplained magical surge, Prophet Gossip Column, unverified. Hogwarts Halloween troll incident, subdued by students, no further detail available. He looked at the growing list for a long time, turning it over in his mind the way he'd once turned over the wardlog ripple that had started all of this 11 years ago, and felt the same cold, patient certainty settle over him now that had settled over him then. Something enormous was gathering inside that boy, one small incident at a time, and whatever it was, whoever else in this country was content to look away from it. Corvin Vane intended to be standing close enough when it finally broke loose to understand exactly what it was made of. He closed the drawer, locked it, and went back to his tea, already thinking about which of his contacts inside the ministry might be persuaded quietly to help him get a closer look. Chapter 3: The Weight of Silence. November settled over Hogwarts in a haze of cold mist and early dark, and Harry found that the troll incident, rather than fading into memory, the way most 11-year-olds brushes with disaster tended to, had instead cemented something between him and Ron and Hermione that felt permanent in a way nothing in his life ever had before. They were, by unspoken agreement, simply together now, 3 seats saved at breakfast without anyone asking, homework spread across the same table in the library every evening, Hermione's increasingly exasperated tutoring sessions squeezed between Ron's Quidditch talk and Harry's practice sessions on his new broom, a gift that had arrived anonymously the week after the troll, and that everyone, teachers included, seemed to know had come from Dumbledore without anyone actually saying so. Harry loved the broom. He loved flying more than he'd loved almost anything in his life, the particular freedom of being 50 feet up with wind screaming past his ears and nobody, for once, able to reach him or grab him or shove him back down. But he hadn't forgotten what the Sorting Hat had told him on his very first night, and he hadn't forgotten the way his own magic had torn loose without warning, once on a train and once in a flooded bathroom, and some quiet, careful part of him had begun, deliberately, to test the edges of whatever lived inside him, small things, private things, late at night behind his bed curtains where nobody could see. He discovered he could make a candle flame bend toward his hand without touching it, if he concentrated hard enough and let something in his chest loosen just slightly, the way you might loosen your grip on a rope without letting go entirely. He discovered that if he pushed a little harder than that, the flame didn't just bend, it jumped, leapt clean off the wick and hovered, for one shivering second, cupped in midair a few inches above his palm, before he yanked the feeling back down and it guttered out, leaving the dormitory smelling faintly of smoke and his hands trembling with something that wasn't quite fear. He never pushed further than that, not yet. Something in him, old, cautious, trained by 11 years at Privet Drive, still whispered that going too far, too fast, always ended badly. But he kept testing, night after night, small increments, learning the shape of the thing inside him the way you'd learn the shape of a room in the dark, one careful step at a time. Snape's second potions lesson of the month began, as they always seemed to, with a pointed question aimed squarely at Harry and delivered in a tone that made it clear failure was expected and would be enjoyed. "Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "I don't know, sir," Harry said, keeping his voice carefully level, because he'd learned by now that any flicker of frustration only seemed to feed whatever appetite Snape had for tormenting him. Pity. Snape's dark eyes lingered on him a beat too long, longer than the question warranted, longer than simple academic contempt would explain, and something about that lingering gaze made the hair on the back of Harry's neck prickle in a way he couldn't name. It happened again 10 minutes later, while Harry bent over his cauldron measuring out crushed snake fangs with more care than the recipe strictly required. A sensation, faint but unmistakable, of something pressing softly against the edges of his mind, testing, probing, like fingers running along a locked door searching for a gap beneath it. Harry's hand slipped. Snake fangs scattered across the workbench, and he looked up sharply, and Snape was watching him from across the room, dark eyes fixed and unblinking, and the pressure in Harry's skull spiked, hard, a sudden shove rather than a gentle probe, and something in Harry reacted before he'd consciously decided to do anything at all. It wasn't like the train, and it wasn't like the troll. There was no visible explosion, no shattered glass, no wind tearing through the room. What happened instead was quieter and stranger. A wave of pressure that seemed to originate somewhere behind Harry's own eyes and lance outward, invisible, and Snape's head snapped back as though he'd been struck, one hand flying up to press against his temple, and a thin line of blood traced down from his nose before he caught himself and wiped it away with the back of his sleeve, too quickly for most of the class to notice. Sir, Hermione, several benches away, had noticed, and her voice carried a note of genuine concern that made several other students turn to look. "Nothing," Snape said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that suggested a great deal of effort was going into keeping it that way. "Continue your work." He did not look at Harry again for the rest of the lesson, and when class ended, he swept out of the dungeon a full 2 minutes before anyone else was permitted to pack up, robes snapping behind him like something wounded. "What was that?" Ron whispered, once they were safely in the corridor. "Did you see his nose? Looked like someone smacked him." "He was doing something," Harry said slowly, still feeling the strange residual ache behind his own eyes, like the aftertaste of a headache that hadn't fully arrived. "Not with a wand. I felt it, like something pushing into my head trying to get in, and then it just stopped all at once and he was bleeding." Hermione's eyes had gone wide and thoughtful in the particular way that meant she'd already started connecting facts in her head faster than she could voice them. "Legilimency," she said quietly, once they'd found an empty stretch of corridor. "It's mind magic, reading thoughts, sometimes even planting them, though that's supposed to be far harder and heavily restricted. It's advanced, Harry, seriously advanced, not the sort of thing anyone teaches at school. If Snape was trying that on you, why would he?" Harry said. "What's he trying to find?" Nobody had an answer to that, and the question settled uneasily over the three of them for the rest of the day, one more addition to a growing list of things about Harry's life that refused to add up into anything sensible. 300 miles south, in the Department of Mysteries, Corvin Vane sat across a narrow table from a woman named Aurelia Finch-Ashby, a mid-level clerk in the Department of Magical Records with tired eyes, and an expensive taste in robes that her ministry salary clearly couldn't fully explain, and slid a small pouch of gold across the table, with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned, over 11 careful years, exactly how to make requests that felt reasonable even when they weren't. "I only need to see the sealed portion," Vane said mildly. "Family records for the Potter line, specifically anything filed under the department's protective statutes after October of 1981. I understand there are restrictions, but I'm not asking you to hand me the file, Aurelia. I'm asking for 20 minutes alone with it in the reading room, which I believe is well within your authority to grant a fellow ministry employee conducting research." "That file's under a level 3 restriction," Aurelia said, though her eyes had already flicked to the gold and lingered there. "Only the headmaster of Hogwarts and the minister's office have standing access. If I pull it for someone outside that list, it's my job." "It's your job if anyone finds out," Vane corrected gently, "and I have never once, in 11 years working in this building, given anyone reason to find anything out." He let that sit a moment, watching her weigh it, and then added in the same mild, reasonable tone, "I'm not interested in causing anyone harm, Aurelia. I study patterns. I've noticed a pattern I think matters, for reasons that go a great deal further than idle curiosity, and I believe understanding it now, quietly, might prevent something considerably worse than a bent ministry regulation somewhere down the line." it wasn't entirely a lie. Vane had built his entire career, and increasingly his entire private obsession, on the conviction that Voldemort's fall hadn't been an accident of love or luck, as the popular story insisted, but the product of a specific, replicable magical phenomenon, one that, if understood and harnessed properly, could be turned into a defense against whatever dark wizard eventually rose to take the last one's place. He believed, genuinely and with the calm certainty of a man who had spent a decade convincing himself of his own righteousness, that whatever lived inside Harry Potter might be the single most important magical discovery of the century, and that a boy's discomfort, even a boy's suffering, was a small price to weigh against decades of future lives saved. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as necessary. Aurelia took the gold. 2 days later, Vane sat alone in a windowless reading room with a thin folder marked Potter, H.J. Restricted, Level 3 spread open in front of him, and read through 11 years of carefully redacted ministry correspondence with the slow, methodical attention of a man assembling a puzzle he already half suspected the shape of. Most of it was mundane, standard notifications to the Muggle Liaison Office regarding Harry's placement with relatives, annual wellness confirmations that appeared to have been rubber-stamped without any actual visit ever taking place. A single brief note from a ministry official 11 years prior confirming that appropriate protective and restrictive measures have been undertaken by the headmaster personally, per his professional judgment, and require no further ministry oversight at this time. Restrictive measures. Vane read the phrase 4 times, turning it over, feeling the same cold certainty settle into his chest that he'd felt 11 years ago reading a ward log ripple 3 miles underground. Dumbledore had done something to the boy. Something deliberate, something significant enough to require ministry sign-off, even in redacted, sanitized form, and something nobody, not the ministry, not the press, not the wizarding public who'd spent a decade telling and retelling the story of the boy who lived, had ever been told about. Vane copied the relevant lines into his own notebook in careful, cramped handwriting, returned the file exactly as he'd found it, and left the ministry that evening with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed a theory he'd been nursing quietly for over a decade. Restrictive measures, he thought, walking home through a cold, rain-slicked London evening. Whatever Dumbledore had bound down inside that boy, it was worth binding. And whatever was worth binding that carefully for that long was worth understanding properly, worth harnessing, worth replicating, worth turning into something that could be handed to every Auror in Britain the next time a Dark Lord rose from the ashes of the last one. He simply needed to find a way to see it for himself, up close, without Dumbledore's watchful eye getting in the way. The first Quidditch match of the season fell on a bright, cold Saturday in early November, Gryffindor against Slytherin, and Harry woke that morning with his stomach in knots that had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the simple, ordinary terror of playing his first real match in front of the entire school. "You'll be brilliant," Ron said through a mouthful of toast, with the easy, uncomplicated confidence of someone who'd grown up believing sport was just something you threw yourself into and figured out along the way. You caught that remembrall without even trying. A snitch is just a smaller, faster version of the same thing. "That's exactly what worries me," Harry muttered, but he ate his breakfast anyway, mostly to give his hands something to do, and Letwood marched the team down to the changing rooms an hour before the match with the grim, exacting focus of a captain who took the sport more seriously than almost anything else in his life. The stands were a wall of color and noise by the time the teams walked out onto the pitch, scarlet and green banners snapping in the wind, and Harry mounted his broom, trying very hard not to think about the fact that several hundred people were about to watch him either succeed spectacularly or fail in front of the entire school. Madame Hooch's whistle cracked, and 15 players shot into the air at once, and for the first few minutes Harry simply flew, circling high above the action, scanning the pitch for a flicker of gold that refused to show itself. It was on his 4th pass, banking hard to avoid a stray bludger that Fred Weasley batted away just in time, that Harry's broom lurched sharply, violently, without warning, and pitched him sideways hard enough that he had to grab the handle with both hands just to stay mounted. For a moment he thought it was simple turbulence, a gust of wind catching him wrong, and then it happened again, worse this time, the broom rolling almost completely upside down before he wrenched it level, and the crowd below had gone from cheering to gasping in the space of a few seconds. He looked down and saw Hermione, several rows up in the stands, gripping a pair of binoculars with an expression of dawning, horrified focus, and beside her Ron shouting, something Harry couldn't hear over the wind and the noise of the crowd. The broom bucked again, harder, and this time it very nearly threw him. He felt his grip slip, felt his body swing sideways off the handle, caught himself with one hand and a leg hooked desperately around the shaft, 40 feet above a stone pitch with absolutely nothing beneath him but air. Somewhere below, someone screamed. The broom continued to buck and twist, entirely of its own accord, clearly under the influence of something that had nothing to do with faulty wood or bad luck, and Harry, hanging one-handed from a broom trying its level best to throw him to his death, felt the old, familiar fear try to claw up his throat. He didn't let it. He'd spent 11 years being told his own strange abilities were shameful, dangerous, something to bury and never speak of, and he'd spent the last 2 months slowly, quietly, unlearning that lesson one small test at a time, a bent candle flame, a flame lifted off its wick, careful increments building towards something he still didn't fully understand. He thought, hanging there with the wind screaming past his face and the ground 40 feet below, not like this, I am not dying because someone else decided to mess with my broom, and reached, deliberately this time, for the thing in his chest that had thrown a troll across a bathroom without his permission. It answered. Warmth flooded down his arm and into the wood beneath his remaining hand, and the broom, mid-buck, suddenly stilled, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a wild animal abruptly deciding to stop struggling, and hung steady in the air as though it had never misbehaved at all. Harry hauled himself back into proper position, breathing hard, and looked down at the wood beneath his palm with something between suspicion and grim satisfaction. There you are, he thought, feeling the broom's own faint enchantment settle beneath his hand, subdued, cowed by whatever he'd just pushed through it. Not today. The crowd below had gone from screaming to a stunned, uncertain murmur, uncertain whether they'd just watched a disaster narrowly avoided or something else entirely. And Harry didn't give them long to decide, because a flicker of gold caught the corner of his eye near the Slytherin end of the pitch, and he was moving before he'd fully finished the thought, broom answering with total, immediate obedience now wind tearing past his ears as he closed the distance at a speed that made the Slytherin seeker. A lanky sixth year who'd had a comfortable head start, glance over his shoulder in visible alarm. Harry didn't slow down. He leaned flat along the broom's shaft, hand outstretched, and closed the last 20 feet in a single desperate burst, and his fingers closed around cold metal wings a full 3 seconds before the Slytherin seeker even got close, and he pulled up hard, holding the snitch aloft, and the Gryffindor end of the stands exploded into noise loud enough to shake the stands themselves. He landed on the grass to a mob of teammates hauling him up onto their shoulders, Wood shouting something about the fastest catch he'd ever witnessed, and it was several minutes before Ron and Hermione managed to fight their way through the crowd to reach him, both looking considerably more shaken than the celebration around them warranted. Your broom, Hermione said, breathless, gripping his arm hard enough to hurt. Harry, your broom was jinxed. I was watching through the binoculars. Someone was doing something to it. I saw it, and I looked to find who and, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the staff stand. Snape, he wasn't blinking. He wasn't taking his eyes off your broom for one single second the entire time it was bucking. Snape jinxed my broom. The idea landed strangely, less shocking than it probably should have been given everything else Harry had already come to suspect about the man. I don't know for certain it was him, Hermione admitted, but I know it looked exactly like he was maintaining a curse, and I know the second you got the broom back under control, he stopped, and it looked painful, Harry. Whatever he was doing, his hands were shaking. Maybe he wasn't cursing it, Ron said slowly, working through it. Maybe he was trying to stop someone else's curse, and it looked the same from where you were sitting. Nobody had an answer for that either, and the question settled over the three of them, uneasily even as the rest of Gryffindor Tower celebrated the victory late into the evening. Fire whiskey smuggled in by Fred and George despite explicit rules against it, Wood loudly proclaiming Harry the finest seeker Hogwarts had produced in a decade. Harry accepted the congratulations with a genuine, if slightly distracted, pleasure. It felt good, being celebrated, being wanted somewhere for something other than being a burden. But underneath the noise and the warmth of the fire, he kept turning the same question over and over. Someone tried to kill me today in front of the entire school, and I stopped it myself, and I'm not scared. Why aren't I scared? He didn't have an answer for that either. But he noticed, turning it over late that night behind his bed curtains, that the absence of fear didn't feel like recklessness. It felt like something closer to trust in whatever lived inside him, trust that had been building slowly, incrementally, ever since a Sorting Hat had told him, on his very first night at Hogwarts, that something enormous was locked away inside him, and that someday it would matter to a great many people. Someday, Harry thought, watching the canopy of his bed shift faintly in the dark, might be sooner than anyone expects. Snape's office, deep in the dungeons, was lined floor to ceiling with jars of preserved things Harry had no desire to identify, and it was there that Dumbledore found him 3 days after the match, sitting alone with his hands wrapped around a mug of something that had long since gone cold. "Minerva tells me you had an unfortunate accident during the match on Saturday," Dumbledore said, settling into the chair opposite without being invited, his tone carefully neutral in the way it became whenever he was navigating a conversation he'd rather not have. "I had a nosebleed, headmaster. Nothing more remarkable than that." "You had a nosebleed at precisely the moment Mr. Potter's broom was behaving as though possessed," Dumbledore said, still gently, still without accusation, though the words themselves carried weight enough. "Minerva watched the whole thing through a spyglass from the staff stand. She says your eyes never left the boy's broom for the entire duration of the disturbance, and that whatever effort you were expending appeared to be considerable." Snape's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring into his cold tea with an expression Dumbledore had learned, over many years, meant he was choosing very carefully what to admit and what to bury. "Quirrell," Snape said finally, low and flat. It was Quirrell cursing the broom. "I saw it the moment the match started, the way he was watching Potter, the way his lips were moving. I was countering it, trying to. It is not a simple thing, holding off another wizard's curse from across a full Quidditch pitch without drawing attention to the fact that you're doing it, and I did not entirely succeed, given the boy nearly fell to his death regardless of my efforts." Dumbledore's expression sharpened, the mild, grandfatherly performance dropping away for a fraction of a second to reveal something colder and considerably more focused underneath. "You believe Quirinus tried to kill Harry Potter in front of the entire school." "I believe," Snape said carefully, "that something is deeply, deeply wrong with Quirinus Quirrell, and I do not think it began this year. I do not know what he is protecting or hiding or working toward, but I know it is not simple cowardice behind that stammer Albus, whatever the rest of the staff wished to believe about him." He set his cold tea down with more force than necessary. "I have my own reasons for watching that boy closely. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not pretend you don't already know precisely what those reasons are. But whatever I feel about him personally is irrelevant next to the fact that someone in this castle is trying to kill him, and I would rather he survive to be resented than die, because the rest of you were too busy trusting a man who flinches at his own shadow." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, weighing that, and then said, carefully, "You've also been observed attempting legilimency on the boy directly. Twice, according to my sources, once in a potions lesson, and I suspect at least once more that went unreported." Something flickered across Snape's face, not quite guilt, closer to frustration. "I was trying to understand what he knows. What Voldemort might have left in him that night, some fragment of intention or memory that might explain why the Dark Lord fixated so completely on that particular child. It seemed a reasonable line of inquiry. And what did you find?" Snape's expression shifted again, subtler this time, something almost like discomfort settling in around his eyes. "Nothing," he said slowly, "of what I was looking for, something else instead. A resistance I have never encountered in a child that age, not deliberate occlumency. He clearly has no training in any such thing, and yet something in his mind pushed back hard enough to draw blood from my nose from a full room's distance. It was not aggression, Albus. It felt almost automatic, like touching a live wire and being thrown backward before you've even registered the shock." He looked up, and his dark eyes, usually so guarded, held something that Dumbledore rarely saw there, genuine professional unease. "I have read minds far better defended than that boy's, and none of them ever hit back on their own." Dumbledore said nothing for a long moment, and in the silence, Snape watched him with a slow, dawning suspicion. "You know something," Snape said. "You've known something about that boy since before he ever set foot in this school, and you have let the rest of us stumble around trying to piece together fragments of it for 2 months while you sit in your tower deciding, presumably, when we've earned the right to be told. There will be a time to explain," Dumbledore said, and even to his own ears the words sounded thinner than they had a decade ago, worn down by repetition into something closer to habit than conviction. "I ask that you trust my judgment on the timing, Severus, as you have trusted it before." "I have trusted your judgment," Snape said quietly, "on a great many things for a great many years, and I have rarely regretted it. But I would ask you to consider, Albus, whether your judgment on this particular matter has ever once been tested against anything other than your own certainty that you were right. He stood, robes settling around him, and there was something in his stance, tired, sharp-edged, unwilling to back down for once, that made Dumbledore's carefully composed expression falter, just slightly. That boy nearly died on a broomstick 3 days ago, in front of 400 witnesses, and whatever you've bound inside him is the only reason he's still breathing to tell anyone about it. I think you should ask yourself how long you intend to keep calling that a secret worth keeping. He left the office without waiting for a response, and Dumbledore sat alone amid jars of preserved things, turning Snape's words over with a discomfort he had not felt in a very long time, because the man was right, and Dumbledore knew it, and knowing it did not make the decision to finally act on it any easier. Harry found Hagrid's hut the following weekend, drawn there mostly by the promise of tea and rock cakes, and the particular uncomplicated warmth of a man who liked him for entirely straightforward reasons, and found, sitting on Hagrid's enormous kitchen table, a battered old newspaper folded open to a photograph of a heavily armored vault deep inside Gringotts. Someone tried to break into Gringotts, Hagrid said, following Harry's gaze, his big weathered face uncharacteristically grim. Vault 700 and something. Empty though whoever it was got there too late. He said it lightly enough, but there was something careful underneath the words, the sound of a man dancing around a subject he'd been explicitly told not to discuss. What was in it? Harry asked, though something in Hagrid's expression told him the answer wasn't coming easily. Can't tell ya that, Harry. Hogwarts business. Very secret. Hagrid busied himself pouring tea with rather more concentration than the task required, and Harry, watching him, filed the reaction away alongside every other half-answer and averted gaze he'd been collecting since September, feeling the shape of some larger secret settling slowly into focus around the edges of his own life. Hagrid, he said carefully, do you know anything about what Dumbledore did to me when I was a baby? After my parents, after Voldemort. Hagrid's hand froze halfway through pouring, tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the cup, and for one long moment he didn't say anything at all, his broad shoulders gone tense in a way Harry had never seen from him before. Now who's been tellin' ye things like that? Hagrid said, and his voice had lost its usual cheerful boom, gone quiet and careful instead. Nobody's told me anything, Harry said. That's the whole problem, Hagrid. Nobody's told me anything, and I keep having these things happen, magic I don't understand and can't control, and every single time I ask a teacher about it, they change the subject or tell me it's nothing to worry about, and I'm starting to think it's not nothing at all. Hagrid set the teapot down very carefully, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with something that sounded almost like guilt. I don't know the details, Harry, and that's God's honest truth. Dumbledore don't tell me things like that. I'm just the fella who fetches folk when they're needed, not the fella who makes the big decisions. But I'll tell ye this much, and I hope I'm not sayin' more than I should. He paused, choosing his next words with visible, painful care. The night I found ye in that cottage, I've never in me life felt anything like what came off ye in that crib. Not before, not since. Dumbledore felt it too, I could see it on his face, and whatever he did after I left with ye, I reckon it had something to do with that. He looked at Harry then, his small black eyes suddenly very serious for a man who usually laughed his way through most conversations. I don't think he did it to hurt ye, Harry, whatever it was. I think he did it 'cause he was scared, and scared men do all sorts of things they'd never do with a clear head, even good men. Specially good men sometimes. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough, and Harry left the hut that evening with more questions than he'd arrived with, but it confirmed something he'd already begun to suspect, piece by piece, since the hat's warning on his first night. Whatever lived inside him had been noticed, immediately, by the one man with enough power and enough knowledge to do something about it, and that man had chosen, deliberately, without ever asking Harry's opinion on the matter, to lock it away rather than let it exist freely in the world. He thought about that, walking back up to the castle through the cold evening air, and found that the feeling settling in his chest wasn't quite anger, not yet. It was something quieter and more patient than that. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of a decision he hadn't fully made yet, but that he could feel forming anyway, the way you can feel a storm building on the horizon long before the first drop of rain actually falls. Whatever you did to me, he thought, looking up at the lit windows of Dumbledore's tower against the darkening sky, you're going to have to explain it eventually, and I don't think I'm going to like waiting much longer to hear it. Behind him, in the gathering dark near the edge of the forest, a shadow that had been watching the exchange between boy and giant from a discreet distance folded itself quietly into the tree line and made its way unseen, back toward the castle's outer boundary, not Hagrid's business, not Dumbledore's, but a visitor who had arrived at Hogwarts 3 days earlier under the entirely mundane cover of a ministry-sanctioned school inspection, carrying credentials that were technically perfectly legitimate. And a private notebook that had grown, in just 3 days of careful, quiet observation, considerably thicker than it had been before. Corvin Vane had seen enough for one evening. He returned to the modest guest quarters the school had arranged for visiting ministry officials, lit a single candle, and began writing, in his small, careful hand, everything he had learned so far: the broom, the bathroom, the sorting, fragments overheard from students who had no idea the man asking casual, friendly questions in the library was anything other than a bored bureaucrat killing time on a dull assignment. He was patient. He had been patient for 11 years already. But patience, he was beginning to suspect, watching that boy from a careful distance and cataloging every small, extraordinary thing that happened around him, was running rather shorter than he had originally planned for, because whatever was locked inside Harry Potter, it was not staying locked much longer, and Vane intended to be close enough when the moment finally came to make certain he understood exactly what broke free. Chapter 4: What the Forest Remembers. Christmas at Hogwarts came with snow thick enough to swallow the grounds whole, and Harry, who had never once in his life spent a Christmas anywhere he actually wanted to be, decided almost without hesitation to stay at the castle rather than return to Privet Drive for the holidays. Ron stayed too, his whole family off visiting relatives in Romania where his brother Charlie worked with dragons, and the two of them had the better part of Gryffindor Tower to themselves, along with a startlingly good breakfast and, on Christmas morning, an actual pile of presents waiting at the foot of Harry's bed, the first he had ever received in his entire life that weren't handed down, rescented, or accompanied by some quiet reminder of how little he deserved them. There was a jumper from Mrs. Weasley, maroon with a large gold H stitched across the front, along with a box of fudge that Ron eyed with open envy. There was a wooden flute from Hagrid that produced a sound closer to a dying goose than music. There was a note from Hermione promising a proper gift once term resumed, and there was, tucked at the very bottom of the pile, a package with no card attached at all, just Harry's name written in a hand he didn't recognize, and inside it, folded in silvery cloth that seemed to shift and ripple like water, an invisibility cloak. "Your father left this in my possession before he died," the accompanying note read, unsigned. "It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." Harry sat holding the cloak for a long time after Ron had gone back to unwrapping his own gifts, running the fabric between his fingers, feeling the faint hum of very old magic in it, and thought about his father, a man he knew only from a handful of photographs and other people's careful, grief-shadowed stories, and about whoever had sent this, and why they'd chosen to stay anonymous when everyone at Hogwarts already knew, one way or another, who tended to arrange things quietly from behind the scenes. He wore it that same night, slipping out of the tower after Ron had fallen asleep, drawn by nothing more specific than the restless, curious energy that had been building in him for weeks, and it was in the third-floor corridor, invisible and silent, that he found the door standing very slightly ajar to a room he'd never seen before, and inside it, an enormous, tarnished mirror standing alone against the far wall. Gold frame carved with looping script he didn't have time to read before the mirror's surface rippled and showed him something that stopped his breath in his chest. He saw himself. Older, maybe 15 or 16, standing tall and easy in a way he'd never once stood in his life, and around him a whole crowd of people, a man with untidy black hair and Harry's own exact eyes, a woman with red hair and a smile that made something ache deep in Harry's chest, an older Ron laughing at something, an older Hermione rolling her eyes fondly beside him. And the Harry in the mirror wasn't hiding anything. He could see it in the reflection's posture, in the easy, unguarded way his mirror self held himself among the people who loved him, whatever had been sealed away, whatever Harry was still only beginning to feel the edges of. The boy in the glass had all of it freely, without apology, and it hadn't destroyed him or anyone around him. It had simply let him be whole. "I rather thought I might find you here eventually." Harry spun round, heart hammering, and found Dumbledore standing just inside the doorway, half-moon spectacles catching the low light, expression unreadable in the dimness. "Sir, Harry fumbled for the cloak clasp, though there seemed little point now. "You needn't explain yourself, Harry. Curiosity is no crime, and this mirror has drawn wiser men than either of us into staring far longer than is good for them." Dumbledore moved further into the room, coming to stand beside him, and looked into the glass himself for a long, quiet moment. "This is the mirror of Arist. It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts. For some, that is a great comfort. For others, it has been a kind of poison, Men have wasted away in front of this mirror, forgetting to eat, forgetting to live. So enraptured were they by a vision of what they could never actually have. I saw my parents, Harry said quietly, still watching the mirror. Harry laughed at something Ron had said. And I saw myself, but different, freer somehow, like something wasn't holding me back. Something in Dumbledore's face tightened very slightly, and for one unguarded second Harry saw something pass behind those bright blue eyes that looked almost like guilt, there and swallowed down before Harry could be entirely certain he'd seen it at all. The heart shows us many things, not all of them entirely literal, Dumbledore said carefully. I would not read too much prophecy into a mirror's reflection, Harry. I think I would though, Harry said, and heard his own voice come out steadier than he expected, steadier than he'd ever managed to sound in front of this man before. Because it's not the first time something's told me there's more to me than I've been allowed to use. The Sorting Hat told me the same thing, my very first night here. Said someone had tied a knot around something big inside me, didn't say who. He looked directly at Dumbledore then, searching that ancient, weathered face for any flicker of reaction. I think you know who, sir. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Harry could hear his own heartbeat in it. There will be a time, Dumbledore said finally, very gently, when I explain everything to you, Harry, in full, and you will understand why certain choices were made, and why I believed, still believe, they were necessary. But that time is not tonight, and I would ask you to trust that I have thought about this a great deal longer than you have had the chance to. You keep saying that, Harry said, and something in his own voice surprised him, not anger, not quite, but something close to it, something that had been building quietly for weeks and had finally found a crack wide enough to slip through. Not the time yet, trust my judgment, but it's my life, sir. It's my magic, whatever it is, and everyone around me seems to know more about it than I do, and I'm getting tired of being the only person in the room who isn't told anything. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, not offense, Harry thought, but something closer to genuine reckoning, the look of a man being made, slowly and uncomfortably, to reconsider a decision he'd been certain of for a very long time. You are 11 years old, Dumbledore said at last, quietly. I know how old I am, Harry said. I don't think that's the point, sir. I think the point is you decided a long time ago that I wasn't allowed to know things about myself, and you've kept deciding it every single day since, and I don't think that's the same thing as protecting me. I think it's just deciding for me, same as everyone else has always done. He hadn't meant to say quite that much. He watched it land on Dumbledore's face and half expected some gentle, deflecting response, the kind of warm non-answer the old man had perfected over decades of being the most powerful wizard in Britain, but instead Dumbledore simply nodded slowly, and there was something almost tired in the movement. You are not entirely wrong, he said, and I will not pretend otherwise to make either of us feel better about it. Go back to your dormitory, Harry. It's very late, and this conversation deserves more time than either of us has left tonight to give it properly. He paused at the door and added, without turning around, the cloak was a good choice for tonight. Use it wisely. I suspect you'll have more need of it before this year is finished than either of us would like. He left, and Harry stood alone in front of the mirror a while longer, watching his reflected self smile at a family he'd never had, and felt, for the first time, that the conversation he'd been dreading and avoiding since September had finally, properly begun, even if it hadn't ended anywhere close to where he needed it to. Term resumed in January with the particular grey misery of a Scottish winter settling permanently over the castle, and it was Hermione, 3 weeks into the new term, who arrived at breakfast one morning, practically vibrating with the particular energy she reserved for having solved something. Nicholas Flamel, she announced, dropping into her seat and sliding a heavy library book across the table with the triumphant air of a woman who had spent every free hour of the last month chasing a single loose thread. I finally found him. It's been driving me mad, that card from the Chocolate Frog, remember, Dumbledore's old partner in alchemy. Vaguely, Ron said through a mouthful of eggs. He's the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone, Hermione said, and lowered her voice as though the great hall might overhear despite the roar of 400 other conversations. It produces the elixir of life, makes the drinker immortal, as long as you keep drinking it, and it turns any metal into pure gold. And Harry, Hagrid mentioned something got moved out of Gringotts around the same time somebody tried to break in. What if it's the stone? What if that's what's under the trapdoor Fluffy's guarding? They'd found the dog by accident weeks earlier, hiding from Filch behind a door on the 3rd floor that turned out to be locked for reasons considerably more serious than anyone had expected. a three-headed monster the size of a small elephant, guarding, as far as any of them could tell, a hidden trapdoor sunk into the stone floor beneath its enormous paws. Harry had assumed at the time it was simply another one of Hogwarts' many eccentricities. Hermione's theory reframed the entire thing into something considerably more dangerous. So someone's trying to steal it, Harry said slowly, and whoever tried to break into Gringotts already failed once, which means they'll try again, Hermione said. Here, where it's actually being kept now. They didn't have to wonder long about who. It was 2 days later, ducking into the library after hours to avoid Filch's evening patrol, that they overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between Snape and Quirrell in an unlit corridor just beyond the restricted section, Snape's voice low and cutting, Quirrell stammering, high-pitched and unmistakably frightened. Don't know what you're tea-talking about, Severus, I assure you. Don't play the fool with me, Quirinus. I know precisely what you attempted at that Quidditch match, and I know precisely why your hands were shaking afterward. Next time you consider trying something so clumsy, be aware that I am watching you far more closely than you appear to have accounted for. I don't know what you mean, then let me be plainer. Whatever it is you serve, whatever promise or threat has you jumping at your own shadow, I would think very carefully before attempting anything further where that boy is concerned. Some of us in this castle are paying rather more attention than you seem to have anticipated. Footsteps retreated in opposite directions, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione emerged from behind the bookshelf. They'd flattened themselves against with the shared, uneasy understanding that they'd just overheard something considerably more significant than an ordinary staff disagreement. Snape thinks Quirrell's the one after the stone, Ron said slowly, once they were safely back in an empty classroom. But he's threatening him to protect it, or to protect you maybe, since he's the one who said your name. Or he's threatening him because he wants the stone himself and doesn't want competition, Hermione countered, chewing her lip. We don't actually know which one of them is lying, Ron, that's the whole problem. Harry didn't say anything for a long moment, turning the whole tangled mess over. Snape's contempt, Snape's legilimency, Snape's apparent willingness to countercurse a broomstick to save his life, Quirrell's stammering fear that had never once, in 4 months, fully explained itself. Somewhere underneath all of it sat a question he hadn't quite let himself ask outright yet. Why does everyone in this castle seem so certain that whatever's coming, it's coming for me specifically? The answer, in the end, came from an entirely unexpected direction, not from the castle at all, but from the forest that bordered it. It was Hermione who spotted the notice pinned to the common room board first, a fortnight later, announcing that first years caught breaking curfew a third time that term would be assigned detention with Hagrid in the Forbidden Forest. And it was Neville, mortified and near tears, who confessed a week after that he'd overheard Malfoy planning to sneak out that very night to catch Harry with something forbidden, having apparently decided, after months of failed provocations, to manufacture the evidence himself. He's got something planned, Neville said miserably, twisting his hands together outside the portrait hole. I heard him telling Crabbe and Goyle, something about getting you caught red-handed with a dragon, if you can believe it. Hagrid's apparently got one hidden in his hut and Malfoy means to report it and drag you into it somehow. It turned out, to nobody's great surprise once the whole sorry business unraveled, that Hagrid genuinely had won a dragon egg in a card game the previous autumn, and had been raising it, with considerable and increasingly obvious difficulty, in a wooden crate beside his fireplace, apparently under the sincere belief that nobody would notice a baby Norwegian ridgeback growing steadily larger and more prone to setting curtains alight. Malfoy caught wind of it through channels nobody ever fully traced, and his attempt to catch Harry, Ron, and Hermione red-handed helping smuggle the creature off to Ron's brother Charlie in Romania resulted, with a kind of grim comedy that felt entirely appropriate to how the whole term had gone so far, in all 4 of them being caught by Filch at once, on the astronomy tower, at 1 in the morning, and marched straight to McGonagall's office in matching disgrace. 50 points from Gryffindor, McGonagall said, her mouth a thin, furious line, and the same from Slytherin, Mr. Malfoy, since you appear to have been equally present at an hour you had no business being anywhere but your own bed. And detention for the lot of you in the Forbidden Forest, with Hagrid, where I trust the experience will impress upon all 4 of you rather more effectively than house points ever could exactly how foolish tonight's little adventure truly was. Harry didn't much mind the detention itself. What he minded, walking down toward the edge of the forest that following evening with Ron, Hermione having been spared at the last moment by a genuinely unwell stomach that even Malfoy's presence couldn't shift her attitude about, was the way Hagrid's usually cheerful face had gone tight and grim the moment he explained what tonight's task actually involved. Something's been killing unicorns in the forest, Hagrid said, holding his crossbow with a great deal more seriousness than Harry had ever seen from him. Found one dead a few weeks back, and another since. Something that hurt a unicorn's got ter be dark, properly dark, nothin' natural wants ter harm a creature that pure. We're goin' in ter find whatever's doin' it, and I want the pair of yes stickin' close ter me the whole way, understand? No wanderin' off. Malfoy, predictably, complained about the assignment being beneath him the entire walk-in, right up until the tree line swallowed the last of the moonlight, and the forest closed dark and close around them, at which point his complaints dried up entirely, replaced by the tight, silent fear of a boy who had never once had to be genuinely brave about anything in his life. They found the first unicorn 20 minutes in, silver white and beautiful even in death, blood pooling black against the dark undergrowth in a way that made something in Harry's stomach turn over. And it was there, crouched beside the body with Hagrid's lantern casting long shadows across the clearing, that Fang the boarhound suddenly bolted, whining, back the way they'd come, leaving the four of them alone in the dark, with something moving through the trees nearby that none of them could yet see. Split up, Hagrid said, low and urgent, apparently trusting even 11-year-old safety over the far greater danger of not covering enough ground. Malfoy, you're with Fang, go on, catch him up, he'll not go far. Harry, Ron, take the path that forks left up ahead and send up green sparks if you find anything, red if ye're in trouble. I'll go straight on. It was, Harry would think much later, an appalling plan born of a man too kind and too straightforward to fully anticipate what waited in these particular woods that night. But there was no time to argue it, and Malfoy had already fled with Fang in the opposite direction, and Hagrid's huge shape had already vanished into the dark ahead, and so Harry and Ron found themselves alone on a narrow forest path, wands out, moving slowly through undergrowth that seemed, with every step, to grow darker and quieter than it had any natural right to. They found the second unicorn a few minutes later, and this one was fresher. Harry smelled it before he saw it, something cold and wrong on the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night around them, and then Ron's hand closed hard on his arm, stopping him dead in the path, because kneeling over the unicorn's body in a small clearing was a hooded, cloaked figure, its face hidden entirely beneath the folds of a dark hood, drinking directly from the wound in the creature's silver throat. The figure's head snapped up at the sound of their approach, and Harry's scar, the thin lightning bolt line above his right eye, quiet and unremarkable for 11 years, exploded into pain so sudden and so total that he cried out and dropped to his knees in the frozen leaves, both hands flying to his forehead as though he could physically hold the pain in. The hooded figure rose and moved toward them with a speed no ordinary man's body should have possessed, gliding low across the clearing floor rather than walking, and Ron screamed something Harry couldn't process through the white-hot agony splitting his skull in two, and then the thing was close enough that Harry, on his knees with tears streaming down his face from the pain, could feel a cold radiating off it that had nothing to do with the winter air. And something inside him, deep down, past the pain, past the fear, woke up. It happened faster than thought, faster, even, than the wave of force that had thrown a troll across a bathroom, faster than whatever had made Snape's nose bleed from across a classroom. One moment Harry was kneeling in agony with a hooded horror bearing down on him and Ron, and the next, something enormous and ancient uncoiled inside his chest with a violence that felt less like magic and more like a held breath, 11 years long, finally released, and a pulse of raw, invisible force tore outward from him in every direction at once, hard enough to snap the smaller branches off nearby trees and send frozen leaves whirling upward in a sudden, screaming vortex. Hard enough that the hooded figure, mere feet from closing the distance, was flung backward through the air as though struck by something the size of a charging bull. The pain in Harry's scar didn't stop. If anything, it sharpened, focused, and beneath it, distant and strange, Harry heard something that wasn't quite a voice and wasn't quite a thought, cold and ancient and utterly, viscerally surprised. What the figure scrambled backward through the undergrowth, hood slipping just enough that Harry caught a flash of something beneath it that was not a face at all, not entirely, something raw and wrong, red-eyed, staring at him from the darkness with an expression that Harry, even through the agony still splitting his skull, recognized without needing to be told: fear. Not the ordinary fear of a creature caught doing something forbidden. Something deeper than that, something closer to instinct, an animal recognizing at the last possible second that it had badly misjudged the size of the thing standing in its way. "It's you," the cold voice said, somewhere far away and yet impossibly close, threading through Harry's mind like ice water. Number not yet. Not like this, and then, before Harry could make sense of any of it, A second shape burst into the clearing from the tree line, a centaur, silver-white and enormous, bow already drawn, and the hooded figure fled into the darkness of the deeper forest, gone in seconds, leaving behind only the dead unicorn, the frozen, torn-up clearing, and Harry, still on his knees, gasping, with Ron staring at him with an expression of complete, shattered disbelief. "Are you hurt?" the centaur asked, lowering his bow slightly, dark eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that had nothing to do with ordinary concern. "My scar," Harry managed, through gritted teeth, the pain finally beginning to ebb now that the thing was gone. "It hurts. It's never hurt like that before. That is not a wound that should concern you overly much tonight, though it will again before this year is finished," the centaur said, in a voice that carried the strange, layered cadence of something speaking half in riddles even when it meant to be direct. "I am called Forenza. What you encountered tonight drinks unicorn blood to sustain a life it should not, by any natural law, still possess, a life half-lived, clinging to existence through means so dark that even speaking them aloud invites misfortune. Some among my kind read the stars and know already what walks in this forest, and know, too, what it seeks." "What does it seek?" Ron asked, voice shaking, wand still gripped tight in both hands. Forenza's dark eyes moved to Harry and lingered there a long moment before he spoke again. "That is not mine to say plainly, young colt, and I would earn my herd's censure for saying even this much. But I will tell you what I observed here tonight, since you witnessed it yourselves regardless. That thing came upon you meaning harm, and it fled from you instead, and it did not flee because a centaur's bow frightened it. It fled because something in you frightened it a great deal more than I ever could." He inclined his head slightly, an oddly formal gesture. "Mars is bright tonight, too bright, some might say, for what it portends. Take care, Harry Potter. Whatever slept in you until tonight does not appear inclined to sleep much longer, and I do not think you yet understand what will come looking for you once it is fully awake." He turned and vanished back into the tree line, hooves silent on the frozen ground in a way that seemed to defy his size entirely, and left Harry and Ron alone in the wrecked clearing with a dead unicorn and a great deal more fear than either of them had walked in with. Hagrid found them minutes later, drawn by the sound of the disturbance, and his broad face went white as milk when he took in the scene, the torn-up ground, the snapped branches scattered in a rough circle around where Harry had knelt, the dead unicorn a dozen feet away. "What in the name of Harry are ye hurt? What happened here?" "Something was drinking the unicorn's blood," Harry said, still shaking, though the shaking now had less to do with fear and more to do with something else entirely, an aftershock, a residue of whatever had torn loose inside him, still humming faintly beneath his skin. "My scar hurt, really hurt, worse than it's ever hurt. And then I don't know what happened exactly. Something just pushed it away, threw it back." Hagrid stared at the torn earth, the snapped branches, and something in his weathered face shifted from fear into a deeper, more careful unease. "We're gettin' you both back ter the castle right now," he said, voice tight. "This weren't meant ter happen. None of this weren't meant ter happen ternight." Dumbledore received Hagrid's account within the hour, standing in his office with the half-giant's huge hands twisting anxiously in front of him as he described what little he understood of the scene he'd found. The dead unicorn, the wrecked clearing, Harry's scar, Forenza's cryptic warning, and by the time Hagrid finished, Dumbledore had gone very still and very pale behind his half-moon spectacles. "You're certain the disturbance radius was that large?" Dumbledore said quietly, once Hagrid had finished. Branches snapped in a full circle around where the boy knelt. "Certain as anythin', headmaster. Never seen the like." Dumbledore was quiet a long moment after Hagrid left, standing alone at the window of his office looking out over dark grounds toward the black wall of the forest beyond, and reached, finally, for the small brass compass on his desk, the one that had, for a decade, pointed steady and unmoving toward Privet Drive, and had trembled twice now since September. The needle was not merely trembling this time. It was spinning, slow and erratic, unable to settle on any fixed point at all, the way a compass spins uselessly too close to something too magnetic to properly read. Dumbledore set it down very carefully and sat, for a long time, in silence. He had built the seal 11 years ago based on a single measurement, a single, terrifying reading taken from a screaming infant in the ashes of a ruined cottage, and he had assumed in all the years since that the binding would hold steady against a slow, gradual, predictable growth as the boy aged, the way any child's magic grows steadily stronger through adolescence. That was the model he had built the entire decision around. That was the reasoning he had used, over and over, to justify never once revisiting the choice. But what he had felt reported to him tonight, a force capable of driving off whatever had been drinking unicorn blood in his forest, strong enough to send Voldemort's own diminished, parasite-thin remnant of a spirit fleeing in what Ferentz's account made unmistakably clear was genuine fear, was not the product of slow, steady, predictable growth at all. It was the sound, Dumbledore understood, sitting alone in his office with a spinning compass, and a decade of careful justifications crumbling slightly further with every passing week, of something straining hard enough against its bindings that the bindings themselves were beginning to fail faster than any model he had built could account for. He thought of the conversation in the mirror room, weeks ago now. You decided a long time ago that I wasn't allowed to know things about myself, and found, for the first time since that Halloween night in 1981, that he did not have a ready answer for the boy waiting, somewhere in his own memory, to justify what he had done. 200 miles south, in a cramped ministry office lined with silver instruments that ticked and hummed to themselves through the small hours of the night, Corvin Vane sat bolt upright at his desk at 11 minutes past midnight, exactly as he had 11 years before, as a ripple tore through the ambient wards of the Department of Mysteries strong enough to rattle the teacup on his desk and send a stack of parchment sliding to the floor. He was at the ward log within seconds, heart hammering with an excitement he hadn't felt in over a decade, and traced the source in under an hour. The Hogwarts grounds, near the edge of the Forbidden Forest, at almost precisely the time his own careful network of paid contacts inside the castle had flagged an unusual detention assignment gone badly, badly wrong. He sat with the readout a long time, studying the shape of the disturbance with the focused, hungry attention of a man who has spent a decade building a single theory and has just watched it prove itself in front of him for the very first time. It's accelerating, he thought, and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite joy settle into his chest, something closer, if he'd been honest with himself, to the particular vindication of a scientist watching a long, patient hypothesis finally begin bearing fruit. Whatever Dumbledore locked away in that boy, it isn't holding the way he thought it would. He pulled his private file from its locked drawer and added a new entry, his handwriting tighter and faster than usual, betraying an urgency he rarely allowed himself to show even on paper. Forbidden Forest incident, magnitude nearly triple previous recorded event, Halloween. Interval between incidents, 11 weeks, down from an estimated multi-year cycle based on original 1981 baseline. Projected trajectory, containment failure within the calendar year, possibly sooner. Recommendation, direct observation required. Remote monitoring no longer sufficient. Must establish closer access before the binding fails entirely and the opportunity is lost to whoever gets there first. He closed the file and sat a long while in the quiet, humming dark of his office, already turning over, with the same patient, methodical care he'd applied to every other piece of this 11-year puzzle. Exactly what closer access to an 11-year-old boy inside one of the most heavily warded buildings in Britain might actually require, and exactly which laws and which people he was prepared to bend or break in order to get it. He did not think of himself, turning that question over, as a man contemplating something monstrous. He thought of himself as a man standing very close to the answer to a question that could, if handled correctly, save more lives in the next war than anyone currently sleeping soundly in the Ministry of Magic had any idea was coming. He simply needed to move faster than Albus Dumbledore's conscience, and faster, if it came to it, than whatever was currently trying to claw its way free of the cage the old man had built. He suspected, closing his notebook and blowing out his candle, that he did not have very much time left to do either. Chapter 5. The Truth Beneath the Cage. Harry didn't sleep that night. He lay in his four-poster with the curtains drawn, staring at the canopy above him, replaying the clearing over and over, the pain, the cold, the voice that wasn't quite a voice saying not yet, not like this, and underneath all of it, quieter but somehow louder than the fear, the memory of what it had felt like when something in him finally answered instead of staying locked down. It hadn't felt like losing control. That was the thing that kept catching in his chest, turning over and over until the gray light of dawn crept in around the curtain edges. Every time his magic had slipped its leash before, the train, the troll, Snape's nose, it had felt sudden, unbidden, something that happened to him rather than something he did. This had felt different. For half a second in that clearing, kneeling in the frozen leaves with his skull splitting apart, he had reached for it the same way he'd reached for his own hand, and it had come. He got up before Ron woke, dressed quietly, and went looking for McGonagall. He found her in her office marking essays, and she looked up at the sight of him with an expression that shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, from mild surprise to something considerably more guarded. "Mr. Potter." I understand last night was rather more eventful than a standard detention ought to be. I want to talk to the headmaster, Harry said. Today, not next week, not when the time is right. Today. McGonagall set down her quill slowly, studying him with the sharp, assessing look she gave students she suspected of being about to do something reckless. That is understandable, given what you encountered. But I would caution you, Potter, that Albus does not respond well to being. With respect, Professor, I don't especially care how he responds. I care about getting an answer. Harry heard his own voice come out flat and steady, none of the trembling apology that had lived in it for 11 years at Privet Drive, and saw something register on McGonagall's face at the sound of it, a flicker of surprise, and beneath that, something that looked almost like approval, quickly suppressed behind her usual severity. I will speak to him, she said finally. Come back after breakfast. Dumbledore's office smelled of lemon and old parchment, and the portraits on the walls watched Harry with the frank, unashamed curiosity of people who had clearly already heard about last night from someone. Fawkes the Phoenix tilted his golden head at Harry from his perch and made a soft, low, musical sound that might have been sympathy. Sit, please, Harry, Dumbledore said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk, and Harry noted with a small, cold clarity that the old man's face looked more tired than he'd ever seen it. The twinkle that usually lived behind those spectacles dimmed down to something duller and more careworn. I'd rather stand, sir. Dumbledore inclined his head, accepting that without argument, and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. Minerva tells me you wish to discuss what happened in the forest. I want to know what you did to me, Harry said. Not eventually, not when you think I'm ready. Now, I want to know why the Sorting Hat told me on my first night that someone had tied a knot around something huge inside me. I want to know why my scar exploded with pain last night, and something inside me answered it hard enough to throw a thing clean off its feet, and I want to know why nobody, not you, not Hagrid, not McGonagall, not anyone, will just tell me the truth about my own body. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the gentle, deflecting warmth it usually carried, gone plain, gone careful, the voice of a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long to remember what it felt like without it. On the night your parents died, he said, I came to Godric's Hollow within the hour. I found you in your crib alive, when every measure of magic I understand said you should not have been. And I felt holding you, something I had never encountered before in a living human being, a magical core of a scale I could not properly measure, larger, I believed then and still believe now, than anything Voldemort himself ever possessed at the height of his power. Harry's chest went tight. And you decided that was a problem. I decided, Dumbledore said, and for the first time in the whole conversation his composure cracked slightly, something raw showing underneath, that an infant with no capacity for judgment, no training, no understanding of consequence, carrying that much raw power inside a body that had not yet learned to walk, was a danger to himself and potentially to everyone around him. I had watched what unchecked power did to men far older and far wiser than you would ever have the chance to be at that age. I had watched it destroy Gellert Grindelwald from the inside before I ever had to raise a wand against him. I did not want that same fate for a child I had just watched become an orphan in the space of a single night. So you sealed it, Harry said. His voice had gone very quiet, very still. Without asking anyone, without asking me. You were a baby, Harry. There was no one to ask. There's been someone to ask for the last 11 years, Harry said, and the words came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the office's warm, lamplit stillness like a blade. You could have told me the day I got my letter. You could have told me my first night here, when the hat warned me something wasn't right. You could have told me after the troll, after the broom, after last night, but you didn't, and I keep asking myself why. And the only answer I can come up with is that you decided a long time ago that I don't get a say in what happens to my own magic, and you've just kept deciding it every single day, because it's easier for you than admitting you might have been wrong. Dumbledore flinched, a small, real flinch, the kind Harry hadn't expected to see cross that ancient, composed face, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. You are not wrong, he said finally, very quietly. I have told myself for 11 years that I was protecting you. That the binding was temporary, a scaffold rather than a cage, something to be loosened as you grew old enough to understand what you carried. I told myself I would explain everything once you arrived at Hogwarts, and then once you had settled in, and then once you were a little older, a little steadier, and every time, Harry, I found a new reason to delay because the truth is that I was afraid. I am still afraid. What I felt in that crib 11 years ago frightened me more than almost anything I have encountered in a very long life. And I do not think I ever fully separated my fear of what you carry from my fear of what it would mean to give you the choice to carry it freely. So it's still there, Harry said. The binding, it's still on me right now. Yes, and it's failing. That's what last night was, wasn't it? That's why it's getting worse. The train, the bathroom, the broom, now this. It's not getting stronger because I'm getting older. It's cracking. Dumbledore's silence this time was answer enough. How much longer before it breaks completely? Harry asked. I do not know, Dumbledore admitted. I built it based on a single measurement taken 11 years ago, and I built it to withstand slow, ordinary growth. What I am observing now does not match that model. I had hoped, foolishly, I now understand, that I would have more time to explain all of this to you properly, on my own terms, before it became urgent enough to force the conversation. I did not expect the choice to be taken from me quite so soon. The choice was never yours to make in the first place, Harry said. That's the whole point, sir. That's what you still don't seem to understand. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied into something harder and more certain than anything he'd managed since walking into the office. I want it gone. All of it. Whatever you locked away, I want it back, and I want to be the one who decides what I do with it. Harry, Dumbledore's voice carried real alarm now, breaking through the careful composure entirely. You do not understand what you are asking. The magic I sealed 11 years ago was already enormous in an infant with no capacity to direct it. It has clearly grown a great deal since then, and if it were released all at once, without preparation, without training, the risk to you, the risk to everyone around you. You keep talking about risk like it's mine to be protected from instead of mine to decide about, Harry said. You've had 11 years to teach me control instead of just locking the whole thing away and hoping it behaved itself. You didn't do that. You just left me at Privet Drive with people who hated me, never checked on me, never taught me anything, and now you're telling me the reason it's dangerous is exactly the same reason you refused to help me learn to handle it in the first place. He heard his own voice shake just slightly on the last few words, and let it, because some things deserve to be said with the full weight of how much they'd cost. You didn't protect me from anything, sir. You just made sure I'd be defenseless for exactly as long as it was convenient for you. Dumbledore looked, for the first time since Harry had known him, genuinely, completely lost for words. I cannot undo it in a single afternoon even were I willing, he said finally, quietly. The binding is old, layered, deeply woven into you at this point. Removing it carelessly could do you real harm, not from the magic itself, necessarily, but from the shock of its release unprepared all at once. Then don't remove it carelessly, Harry said. Help me, teach me what I need to know so it doesn't hurt me when it comes loose. But don't tell me it's staying locked, because it's not, sir. It's already coming loose whether either of us wants it to or not, and I would rather learn to hold it than have it break free of me in the middle of something worse than a troll or a hooded thing in the woods. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment, really studied him, the way Harry imagined he might study an unfamiliar spell, weighing every angle of it, and something shifted behind those tired blue eyes, some old certainty finally, visibly, giving way. You have grown a very great deal in 5 months, he said quietly. Far more than I accounted for when I built that model 11 years ago. He was silent a moment longer, and then slowly he nodded. I will not remove the seal today, Harry. I want to be plain with you about that, because I think you deserve plainness more than you deserve comfort right now. But I will begin, properly, honestly, without further delay, teaching you what I should have begun teaching you the moment you arrived at this school. And I will look seriously at what loosening the binding safely might require, rather than simply hoping it holds. That is what I can offer you today. It is not everything you are asking for, but it is not nothing either. Harry looked at him for a long moment, this ancient, powerful, exhausted man who had shaped 11 years of his life without ever once asking his permission, and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite forgiveness, wasn't quite acceptance, but was perhaps a kind of grim, provisional agreement to keep moving forward rather than staying stuck in the wreckage of what had already happened. Fine, he said, but I'm not waiting 11 more years for the rest of it. No, Dumbledore said, and something in his voice sounded almost relieved to say it. I do not imagine you will. He told Ron and Hermione that evening, in a quiet corner of the common room after most of Gryffindor had gone up to bed, and watched their faces move through disbelief into something more complicated as he laid out, as plainly as he could manage, everything Dumbledore had told him. He just sealed it, Ron said slowly, staring at the fire. When you were a baby, didn't ask anyone, didn't tell anyone, not even you later, when you were old enough to ask. That's about the size of it, Harry said. That's... Hermione's voice had gone tight with an anger Harry hadn't quite expected from her, given how carefully she usually reasoned her way through things. Harry, that's not protection, he took away your ability to consent to something about your own body for over a decade. Even if his reasons made sense, even if he genuinely believed it was necessary, he should have told you the moment you were old enough to understand any part of it, and he didn't, and he let you go on not understanding why strange, frightening things kept happening to you your entire life. I know, Harry said quietly. I told him more or less exactly that. What'd he say? Ron asked. That he's going to help me now, teach me properly, instead of just leaving me to figure it out myself. Harry looked into the fire, watching the flames shift and settle. I don't know if I trust that yet, but it's more than nothing, and right now nothing's been the only thing on offer for 11 years, so I'll take it. Hermione was quiet a moment, and then said, carefully, You're not scared of it, whatever's underneath the seal. Most people would be terrified to find out they've got something that big locked inside them that even Dumbledore was frightened enough to bind down. Harry thought about that, really thought about it, turning the question over the way he'd learned to turn over every strange, unresolved thing that had happened to him since September, and found, when he answered, that the answer surprised even him with how simply true it felt. I think I spent 11 years being scared of it because everyone around me told me I should be, he said slowly. Aunt Petunia, Uncle Vernon, every time something strange happened, they made it feel like proof I was broken, dangerous, something to be ashamed of. And then I get here, and everyone keeps telling me in bits and pieces that whatever's locked inside me is enormous and important and worth being afraid of, and I keep waiting to feel afraid, and I don't. I just feel like something that was always mine got taken away before I ever had the chance to decide what to do with it myself, and now I want it back. He looked up at both of them, firelight flickering across his face. I'm not scared of what I am. I think I'm just tired of everyone else deciding it for me. Ron didn't say anything for a long moment, and then reached over and clapped Harry once on the shoulder, hard, in the particular wordless way he had of saying things he didn't quite know how to put into speech. Hermione, beside him, simply nodded, slow and thoughtful, and said, Then we help you figure out how to be ready for it, properly ready, not just Dumbledore's version of ready. The lessons began 3 days later, in a disused classroom on the 4th floor that Dumbledore had apparently warded against outside observation, with a thoroughness that made Harry wonder, not for the first time, exactly how careful the old man had become about who might be watching. We will begin, Dumbledore said, standing at the center of the empty room with his wand loosely in hand, with something very small. I want you to understand, before anything else, that control is not about suppression. That has been your entire experience of your own magic so far, and it is the reason you have found yourself surprised by it so often. Control is about direction, about choosing deliberately where the power goes rather than simply hoping it stays quiet until it doesn't. He had Harry practice, that first evening, moving a single candle flame across the room without letting it grow, without letting it flare, small, precise, deliberate motions that felt, after months of accidental explosions, almost frustratingly gentle. Harry hated it for the first 20 minutes. By the end of the hour, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's chill, he found something had shifted in how the magic felt beneath his hands, less like an unpredictable animal straining against a leash, more like an instrument he was slowly, painstakingly, learning to play. You learn faster than I expected, Dumbledore admitted at the end of the second lesson, watching Harry hold a small, steady sphere of light suspended above his palm without flickering. Faster, I confess, than I have seen in a student in a very long time. Maybe I've had more practice than you think, Harry said. I've been testing it myself at night behind my curtains. Small things, nothing you'd have noticed. Something crossed Dumbledore's face, surprise, and beneath it, a flicker of something that looked almost like pride, quickly and carefully suppressed. Then perhaps, he said, I underestimated exactly how much of this you had already begun to teach yourself, with no help from me at all. Maybe you did, Harry said, and didn't apologize for the edge in his voice, and Dumbledore, to his credit, didn't ask him to. Corvin Vane's problem, as he saw it, was one of access rather than knowledge. He knew, by early February, with a certainty that had crystallized over 5 months of patient, careful observation, exactly what he believed Harry Potter to be. A live, walking demonstration of a magical phenomenon that could, if properly studied and eventually replicated, revolutionize Britain's ability to defend itself against the next Dark Lord the way nothing in the Ministry's current arsenal remotely could. What he did not have was any legitimate way to get close enough to the boy to study him directly, and Hogwarts, he had discovered during his brief tenure as a visiting school inspector, was considerably better warded against outside intrusion than he had initially credited. He had also, over those same 5 months, developed a healthy respect for how closely the boy was already being watched, by Dumbledore, by McGonagall, by a potions master whose motives Vane still hadn't fully untangled, and more recently, by something else entirely that his ward monitoring had flagged only obliquely. A presence in the forest bordering the school grounds, ancient and dangerous, that seemed to be circling the boy the same way Vane himself was, for reasons Vane suspected were considerably darker than his own. He decided, finally, in early February, that the safest and most direct route was not through the castle at all. It was through the boy's relatives, ordinary muggles, unprotected by any ministry oversight, who would have no idea how to resist a determined, patient man, willing to break several laws quietly and cleanly in pursuit of a single conversation. He arrived at Privet Drive on a gray Tuesday afternoon during the boys' Easter holidays, having confirmed through careful inquiry that Harry Potter would, in fact, be spending a portion of his spring break at his aunt and uncle's house before returning to Hogwarts, a detail nobody at the ministry had thought worth restricting access to, because nobody at the ministry, apart from Vane himself, had any idea it mattered. He knocked on the door of number 4 in the guise of a ministry welfare inspector, robes charmed to look like an ordinary gray suit, credentials forged with a competence 11 years in the Department of Mysteries had given him ample opportunity to perfect, and Aunt Petunia, thin-lipped and suspicious, let him in only because his paperwork insisted, falsely but convincingly, that failing to cooperate would result in a formal inquiry into the household's compliance with statutory child welfare obligations. "He's out back," Petunia said, with the particular flat distaste she reserved for anything related to her nephew, doing chores. "I don't see why the ministry needs to talk to him at all. We've kept up our end of things perfectly well." "Just a routine check, Mrs. Dursley," Vane said mildly, and let himself out through the kitchen into the small, neat back garden, where Harry, 13 years old in body but carrying himself, Vane noted immediately with the sharp, cataloging attention of a man who had spent months studying second-hand accounts of exactly this, with a stillness and self-possession that no ordinary 11-year-old ought to have, was weeding a flower bed with the mechanical, joyless efficiency of long practice. Harry looked up at the sound of footsteps, and something in his gaze sharpened immediately, not fear, Vane noted with the first small flicker of genuine unease he'd felt in this entire endeavor, but a kind of alert, assessing wariness that reminded him uncomfortably of watching a trained duelist notice an unfamiliar wand being drawn. "Who are you?" Harry asked, straightening, wiping dirt from his hands. "Corvin Vane, Department of Mysteries, Ministry of Magic." He kept his voice easy, unhurried, the same careful, reasonable tone he'd used on Aurelia Finchashby and a dozen other people over the years whose cooperation he'd needed. "I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time, Mr. Potter. I promise it will be considerably more interesting than weeding a flower bed. My aunt let you in. She believes I'm conducting a welfare check, which is not, strictly speaking, untrue. I am concerned for your welfare in a manner of speaking." Vane smiled, and it was a genuinely warm smile, the smile of a man who believed with complete sincerity that he was doing something important and good. "I've studied a great deal about what happened the night your parents died, Harry, about what survived that curse and how. I believe you carry something extraordinarily important, not just to you, but to a great many people who will one day need protecting from something as dangerous as Voldemort was. I would like to understand it better, with your help, if you're willing to give it." Harry studied him for a long moment, and Vane watched, with the professional attention of a man cataloging every small detail, as something in the boy's posture shifted, not toward fear, not toward the flustered uncertainty Vane had half expected from an 11-year-old confronted by a strange ministry official making cryptic claims about his own body. Something closer to cold, deliberate calculation. "You've been watching me," Harry said, "not just today, longer than that. I have taken an interest, yes, a professional one." "How long?" "Since the night you survived the killing curse, if I'm honest with you," Vane said. "Longer than anyone else outside Hogwarts has bothered to, I suspect, apart from the headmaster himself." He let that land, watching for a reaction, and was rewarded with a small, sharp tightening around Harry's eyes at the mention of Dumbledore. "I know about the seal, Harry. I don't know every detail. The headmaster has been admirably thorough in keeping this quiet, but I know enough to understand that what's locked inside you is unlike anything recorded in this country's magical history, and I know that it's not staying locked much longer. I'd like to help you understand it, properly, scientifically, before it breaks loose somewhere dangerous and uncontrolled." "You want to study me," Harry said flatly. "I want to understand you," Vane corrected, gently. There's a difference, and I think, given time, you'd come to see that I mean you no harm at all. Quite the opposite. What you carry could save thousands of lives, Harry, in the right hands, properly harnessed and understood. I think deep down, a part of you already suspects that's true, otherwise you wouldn't be so angry that Dumbledore locked it away from you in the first place. It was, Vane thought, a genuinely persuasive argument, built on months of careful observation and reasoning, and he watched Harry's face for the flicker of uncertainty he expected it to produce. What he got instead was something considerably colder. "You've been watching me for 11 years, Harry said slowly, and instead of telling anyone what you knew or trying to help, you just collected information, waited. And now you're standing in my aunt's garden, having lied your way into her house, asking me to hand over something you clearly think is the single most important discovery of your career, and you're doing it by telling me it's for my own good." He shook his head, something in his expression settling into a flat, unimpressed certainty that made Vane's carefully rehearsed confidence falter for the first time. "You sound exactly like Dumbledore, just with worse manners about admitting what you actually want." "I am not attempting to control you, Harry," Vane said, keeping his voice level despite the small, unexpected sting of the comparison. "I am attempting to understand something that could genuinely help protect this country's future. I would think a boy who's already lost so much to one dark wizard would want to make certain no other family suffers the way yours did." "I would," Harry said, "but that's not actually what you're offering, is it? You're not asking me to help protect anyone. You're asking me to let you take me apart to see how I work, and dress it up as something noble so it doesn't feel like what it actually is." He took a step closer, and Vane, despite himself, despite 11 years of careful, controlled professionalism, felt a small, primal instinct to step back that he suppressed through sheer force of will. "I've had enough people in my life decide what's good for me without asking. I'm not doing it again, not for Dumbledore and not for you." "Harry, you should leave now," Harry said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet and very still, the calm, deliberate stillness of a much older person entirely. "You lied your way into my aunt's house, and I could make this very difficult for you if I wanted to. I imagine impersonating a ministry welfare inspector to gain access to a minor isn't something your department looks kindly on, whatever you've convinced yourself your reasons justify. I'd rather not have to explain any of that to anyone, so I'm asking you politely once to walk back through that house and not come near me again." Vane studied the boy for a long moment, weighing his options with the same cold, methodical calculation he applied to everything, and felt, for the first time in this entire 11-year endeavor, a genuine flicker of uncertainty about whether he had correctly calculated the risk involved in this particular pursuit. "You misunderstand me," he said carefully. "I have no wish to harm you or force anything from you against your will. I only—" He did not finish the sentence, because the air around him had gone suddenly, sharply cold, and the small garden's ordinary afternoon light seemed to dim by several degrees all at once. And Vane, a trained unspeakable, a man who had spent 11 years around some of the strangest and most dangerous magic in Britain without once losing his composure, felt something pressed down on him from all sides at once, invisible and vast and utterly without malice. The way the deep ocean presses down without meaning anything personal by it at all, it did not hurt him, it did not so much as ruffle his hair. But it made every instinct in his body scream, all at once, that he was standing entirely too close to something that could, with the smallest shift of intention, end him without effort. And Harry had not raised his wand, had not moved from where he stood, had done nothing at all except let Vane feel, for one single controlled second, the barest edge of what lived beneath a decade-old seal that was already, visibly, beginning to fail. "I said," Harry repeated, voice still perfectly calm, perfectly level, "you should leave now." Vane left. He did not run quite, but it was a close thing, and he did not look back until he was well clear of Privet Drive, standing on the corner of the ordinary suburban street with his hands, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, trembling slightly. That, he thought, was not a warning shot. That was a demonstration. He had spent 11 years theorizing about the scale of what Dumbledore had locked away, building models, extrapolating from fragments of second-hand information, and none of it, had prepared him for the simple, visceral reality of standing 3 feet from an unarmed, seemingly unremarkable 13-year-old boy, and feeling, with total bone-deep certainty, that his own life had rested entirely in that boy's hands for one full second, and had only been spared because the boy had chosen, quite deliberately, not to close them. He walked back toward the nearest apparition point with his notebook still in his coat pocket, unwritten in, and understood, with a clarity that unsettled him more than anything he'd learned in 11 years of patient research, that whatever timeline he had projected for approaching Harry Potter directly needed to be abandoned entirely. He is not a discovery waiting to be made, Vane thought, apparating away from Privet Drive with the particular chill of a man recalculating an equation he had gotten badly, dangerously wrong. He is already something, and he already knows it, and I have just made myself an enemy of the single most powerful thing I have ever encountered in this profession. He did not go back to Privet Drive. He did not attempt to approach Harry Potter again that spring. But he did not stop watching either, and he did not stop believing, with the same cold, patient, unshakable conviction that had driven him for 11 years, that eventually, one way or another, he would find a way to be standing close enough, when the seal finally broke completely, to understand exactly what walked free. Harry didn't tell Dumbledore about Vane's visit. He thought about it, turning the strange encounter over that evening in the privacy of his cupboard-turned bedroom. The Dursleys had, with obvious reluctance, moved him into Dudley's old room the previous summer after Hagrid's pointed threats, though the improvement had done little to change how they treated him otherwise, and decided in the end that this was one secret he intended to keep for himself, not out of malice, not even entirely out of distrust, but because something in the encounter had crystallized a thought that had been building in him for weeks, ever since that conversation in Dumbledore's office, that there would always be people, well-meaning or otherwise, powerful or ordinary, wearing kind faces or cruel ones, who believed they had the right to decide what should be done with whatever lived inside him. Dumbledore had believed it out of fear. Vane believed it out of a cold, calculated sense of the greater good. And Harry understood, lying awake that night with the summer stars visible through Dudley's old curtains, that the only way any of that would ever truly stop was if he made absolutely certain, from now on, that the decision belonged to him and no one else. He thought about the sphere of light he'd learned to hold steady in his palm without flickering. He thought about the cold, ancient fear he'd glimpsed in a hooded creature's stolen glance in the forest. He thought about Vane's face, pale and shaken, backing away across an ordinary suburban garden from a boy who hadn't even raised his wand. I'm not scared of it anymore, he thought, and meant it more completely than he ever had before. I think it's finally starting to be scared of anyone who tries to take it from me instead. He fell asleep sometime after midnight, and for the first time since he could remember, he did not dream of cupboards, or locked doors, or being made to feel smaller than he actually was. He dreamed instead of standing at the edge of the forest with something vast and ancient uncoiling gently beneath his skin, waiting, patient and enormous, for the day he finally, fully, let it all the way out. Chapter 6 Unbound. By the time the exams loomed in June, Harry could hold a flame steady in open air for 10 full minutes without so much as a flicker, could lift and turn 3 separate objects at once with nothing more than a thought and the faintest twitch of 2 fingers, and had learned, at Dumbledore's careful, deliberate insistence, to feel the exact shape of the seal itself, a dense, layered knot of old magic wound tight around something far larger underneath it, like a fist clenched so long it had forgotten how to open. You can feel where it's thinning, Dumbledore said, one warm evening in late May, watching Harry hold his palm flat against his own chest with his eyes closed, feeling for the pressure points the way he'd been taught. Where specifically? Here, Harry pressed 2 fingers just below his ribs on the left side. It's like a seam, like a jumper that's been worn too many times in the same spot. I can feel it fraying every time something big happens. The train, the troll, the forest. He opened his eyes. It's not going to hold much longer, is it? No, Dumbledore admitted. I do not believe it is. He was quiet a moment, turning something over behind those tired blue eyes, and then said, more carefully than he usually spoke, I have been giving serious thought to unbinding the rest of it myself, deliberately, under controlled circumstances, rather than allowing it to fail on its own terms in some unpredictable moment. I would want Madame Pomfrey present, possibly Professor McGonagall as well in case anything requires management. When? Harry asked and heard the eagerness in his own voice before he could soften it. Not yet. I want to be certain we've prepared you as thoroughly as circumstances allow, and I confess I am still working through precisely how the unbinding itself ought to be performed without doing you harm. He paused. There is also the matter of Professor Quirrell, which I would rather resolve before adding any further variables to an already delicate situation. Harry's jaw tightened at the name. You know it's him. You've known for a while. I have suspected for some time, Dumbledore said. I have simply lacked sufficient proof to act, and I did not wish to move against a member of my own staff without certainty, particularly given what, or who, I believe is truly responsible. He didn't elaborate further, and Harry, who had learned by now which of Dumbledore's silences were worth pushing against, and which weren't, let it lie, though the unease of it followed him out of the office, and down through the castle's evening corridors like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He didn't have to wait long to find out. He was right to be uneasy. It was Hagrid 3 days later who let it slip, not maliciously, not even carelessly, but with the guileless, easily flustered honesty of a man who had never learned to lie convincingly about anything in his life. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had gone down to his hut on the pretext of a friendly visit, but really to press him, gently, about whatever he might know regarding the stone's remaining defenses, and Hagrid, 3 tankards of something strong into an otherwise quiet afternoon, let it all come tumbling out with barely any resistance at all. "Professor Sprout's got a plant down there that'll strangle ye if ye panic," he said, counting off on thick fingers, apparently no longer entirely tracking that he was giving away privileged information to 3 11-year-olds. "Flitwick's charmed a room full o' flyin' keys, only one of 'em opens the next door. McGonagall's got a chest set the size o' this room, and ye've got ter play it proper ter get through. Snape set some sort a potion riddle logic puzzle, he called it, very pleased with himself about it. And Quirrell's," he stopped abruptly, blinking, as though only just now realizing how much he'd already said. "Quirrell's what, Hagrid?" Hermione asked, very gently, very carefully, the way you'd coax a nervous animal. "Never you mind that," Hagrid said, going faintly pink. "That's between the professors and Dumbledore, and none o' your business at all. Forget I said anything." They didn't forget it. They talked about almost nothing else for the rest of that evening, and by the time they reconvened in an empty classroom the following afternoon, Hermione had already worked out, through a combination of overheard staff conversation and her own relentless research, that Flamel Stone was almost certainly guarded by exactly the kind of layered, multi-professor obstacle course Hagrid had accidentally described, and that whatever final Peace Quirrell was contributing, it was, in all likelihood, the last line of defense standing between the stone and whoever meant to steal it. "Which means," Ron said slowly, working through it, "if Quirrell's guarding it and Quirrell's also the one trying to steal it, then he doesn't need to break through his own defense at all," Hermione finished. "He just needs to get past everyone else's, and he's had all year to study exactly how they work because he helped build one of them." Harry sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place with the particular, cold clarity that had become familiar to him over the last several months. Not fear, not quite, but a sharpening of focus, the sensation of a decision crystallizing before he'd fully finished thinking it through. "We should tell Dumbledore," Hermione said. "He already suspects," Harry said. "He told me himself, he's just waiting for proof." "Then we get him proof," Ron said. It was, in the end, considerably simpler and considerably more urgent than any of them expected. That very evening, hurrying back from the library after curfew with a stack of books on alchemy Hermione had insisted they needed, they passed close enough to the staff room to overhear McGonagall's raised, urgent voice through the half-open door, informing another teacher, in tones of genuine alarm, that Dumbledore had received an emergency owl from the Ministry that afternoon and had left the school not 20 minutes ago, called away with no indication of how long he'd be gone. Harry felt the floor drop slightly beneath him. "He's going tonight," he said, the certainty of it settling over him cold and absolute. "Quirrell, he's not going to get a better chance than this." "We have to tell someone," Hermione said, already turning back toward the staff room. "There's no time," Harry said. "By the time anyone believes us and organizes a response, it'll be over. We have to go now." The third-floor corridor was dim and silent when they reached it, and the door to Fluffy's chamber stood already ajar, not forced, not broken, simply open, as though someone had walked through it recently and hadn't bothered to hide the fact. Fluffy himself lay slumped on the floor in front of the trapdoor, all 3 heads snoring in unison, a small, delicate harp lying discarded beside him, still faintly humming the last notes of whatever enchanted lullaby had put him under. "Someone's already down there," Ron whispered. "Then we go after them," Harry said, and dropped through the trapdoor before either of them could argue, landing on something soft and springy that turned out, a moment later, to be Devil's snare, cold, wet tendrils immediately winding up around his ankles, tightening with the particular malicious enthusiasm of a plant that enjoyed its work. "Relax." Hermione's voice rang out from above, dropping through after him, with considerably more presence of mind than Harry had managed. "It's the struggling that makes it tighten. Relax completely, let it think you've given up," she demonstrated, going limp, and the plant, apparently satisfied, loosened enough that she could slip free and drop the last few feet to the floor below. Harry followed her example, forcing himself still despite every instinct screaming to fight, and felt the tendrils slacken enough to wriggle loose. Ron, dropping through last and panicking rather more visibly, needed Hermione's calm, shouted instructions, and a well-timed jet of blue fire from her wand before he too tumbled free. The room of flying keys came next, a vast chamber with a locked door at the far end, and a swarm of glittering, winged keys circling near the ceiling like a flock of agitated birds. Old broomsticks leaned against one wall, clearly meant for exactly this purpose, and Harry mounted one without hesitation, feeling the familiar rush of the air taking his weight, and spent a full, exhilarating minute weaving through the darting, evasive swarm before his hand closed around a large, old-fashioned silver key with a bent wing, exactly matching the lock on the door. McGonagall's chess set waited beyond that, towering black and white pieces standing silent and enormous in a checkered hall, and it was Ron, to everyone's quiet surprise, who took immediate, confident charge, directing them into position with the calm, practiced authority of someone who had played this exact game 1,000 times over a real board and simply needed to scale the strategy up. "I'll be a knight," he said, already moving into place. "Harry Bishop, Hermione the other bishop. We need to lose a few pieces to open this up properly. Don't panic when it looks bad. It's meant to look bad." The game that followed was brutal and fast, black pieces shattering into rubble as they were taken, white pieces advancing with grim, silent purpose, and it ended with Ron sacrificing his own knight in a move that left him lying stunned and pale on the stone floor as the White Queen swept through the space where he'd stood. But the sacrifice opened the board, and Harry, moving into the final position with his heart in his throat, delivered checkmate against the White King 3 moves later, and the pieces bowed. And the far door swung open. "Ron," Harry started, kneeling beside his friend. "Go," Ron managed, groggy but alive, waving him off with obvious effort. "Get Hermione through." "I'll be fine, Madame Pomfrey'll sort me out." "Go, Harry, before whoever's ahead of you gets there first." They left him there reluctantly and moved into the next chamber, a room that stank of something foul and rotting, and there, sprawled unconscious on the floor amid the wreckage of what looked like a fully grown troll, considerably larger and more thoroughly beaten than the one from Halloween, lay evidence that whoever had come through ahead of them had not needed to solve this particular puzzle at all. They'd simply gone straight through it. "Snape's puzzle next," Hermione said, voice tight, stepping carefully around the unconscious troll. "The potions. Logic, remember, this is the one I might actually be able to help with." The chamber beyond held a row of 7 bottles lined up on a table between 2 walls of flame, one wall leading backward, out the way they'd come, the other leading onward, deeper toward whatever waited at the heart of it all, along with a scrap of parchment covered in cryptic verse that Hermione read through twice, her lips moving silently, before her face cleared with sudden, triumphant understanding. "This one," she said, lifting a small, round bottle from the middle of the row. "This lets us go forward. But there's only enough for one person, Harry. Look, it's barely a mouthful." She looked at him, and something in her expression had gone very serious, very steady. "You have to go on alone from here. Hermione, I mean it. Whatever's waiting through there, it's not something I can help you fight. I'm not," she faltered, just slightly, and then pushed through it, her voice firm again. "I'm not what you are, Harry. Whatever's coming loose inside you, it's the only thing that's going to matter once you're through that door. Go, I'll get Ron, we'll get help. We'll be right behind you as soon as we can." Harry looked at her for a long moment, this fierce, brilliant, frightened girl who had, in less than a year, become one of the 2 people in the entire world he trusted without reservation, and felt something steady and certain settle over him. "Thank you," he said simply, and drank the potion, and felt cold flame wash harmlessly over his skin as he stepped through the wall of fire and left her behind. The final chamber was vast and circular, lit by torches burning low blue flame along the walls, and at its center stood a raised dais with a plain stone mirror-like surface. Not the mirror of Arist, Harry realized almost immediately, something else, something plainer and more functional, and standing in front of it, back turned, was Professor Quirrell. "Yes," Quirrell said, without turning around, his voice steady now, entirely free of the stammer that had defined every single interaction Harry had had with him since September. "I wondered whether you would make it this far, Potter. I confess I rather hoped you wouldn't. It would have saved us both a great deal of unpleasantness." "Where's the stone?" Harry asked, wand already drawn, though some deep, quiet part of him understood that the wand was, at this point, almost an afterthought. "In the mirror," Quirrell said, turning at last to face him, and his expression, calm, cold, utterly without the nervous flinching Harry had grown used to, was somehow more unsettling than the stammer had ever been. "It won't give itself up easily. Only someone who wishes to find the stone, not use it, will be able to retrieve it, according to Dumbledore's clever little charm. Which is rather inconvenient for me, since I wish to use it a great deal." He tilted his head, studying Harry with something that mingled curiosity and irritation. "Perhaps you'd care to try, since you're here. You think I'll just hand it to you?" "I think," Quirrell said, "that you don't have very much choice in the matter." He raised his wand and cords shot from the tip, wrapping tight around Harry's arms and legs before he could react, binding him rigid where he stood. "There, much better. Now, let's see whether you're of any use to me at all." He shoved Harry roughly toward the mirror, and Harry, bound and furious, looked into its plain surface and saw nothing at first, only his own reflection, and then slowly his reflection's hand reaching into its own pocket and withdrawing a small blood-red stone, holding it up, winking once with a knowing, deliberate expression, before slipping it back into the pocket. Harry felt something drop, warm and solid, into his actual pocket a heartbeat later. "He's got it," he thought with a cold, sinking certainty, "and he doesn't know it yet." "What do you see?" Quirrell demanded. "Nothing," Harry lied, "just myself." Quirrell's face twisted with frustration, and it was in that moment, with Harry bound and lying and the stone a small, heavy weight against his hip, that a second voice spoke, and it did not come from Quirrell's mouth at all, though it emerged from somewhere far too close to it. "He lies," the voice said, cold and thin and dreadfully, wrongly familiar, the same voice Harry had heard threading through his mind in the forest, cold water where blood should have been. "Let me speak to him, face to face." "Master, you're not strong enough. I have strength enough for this," the voice snapped, and Quirrell, with visible, trembling reluctance, began unwrapping the turban from his own head. Harry watched, cord still binding him tight, feeling his stomach turn over as the fabric fell away and Quirrell turned slowly around, presenting the back of his skull. And there, where a face should never have grown, was a second face entirely, snake-like and raw, red eyes glinting in torchlight, a face that had haunted a decade of wizarding nightmares reduced to something small and parasitic and clinging desperately to borrowed life. "Harry Potter," Voldemort said, and his thin lips curved into something that might once have been a smile. "See what I have become. I exist now only through the generosity of others, through unicorn blood, through the body of a fool willing to share his own flesh in exchange for promises of power. But that changes tonight, doesn't it? With the stone I will have a body of my own again. And with you," the red eyes glittered with something that looked disturbingly like anticipation, "with whatever slumbers inside you, I believe I might finally have something worth the trouble of surviving for." "You know about it," Harry said. "The forest." "You felt it." "I felt something," Voldemort said, "that frightened me more than I have been frightened since I was a boy no older than you are now. I have spent a decade as little more than a whisper, Harry Potter, clinging to whatever host would have me, and in all that time nothing has ever come close to matching the terror I felt kneeling in that clearing with you on the ground before me. I do not know precisely what Dumbledore has locked inside you, but I intend to find out, one way or another, and I intend to make certain that whatever it is, it serves me rather than opposes me, before this night is finished." "You want to use it," Harry said slowly, "same as everyone else. Dumbledore wanted to bury it, some ministry man tried to study it, and now you want to steal it." Something cold and absolutely certain settled over him, spreading outward from his chest like ice across still water. "None of you ever once asked me what I wanted to do with it myself. What you want," Voldemort said with something close to contempt, "is irrelevant to what will happen tonight regardless. Give me the stone, Harry, and I may yet let you live to see whatever you might have become, once I've finished taking what I need from you." "No," Harry said. The word came out flat and absolute, and something in the chamber seemed to shift at the sound of it, the torches flickering low, the air pressing suddenly cold and thick, and Voldemort's red eyes narrowed with something that might have been the first flicker of genuine uncertainty Harry had seen from him. "You are bound," Voldemort said, though there was less conviction in it than there had been a moment ago. "You have no wand in hand, no way to fight. I've spent 11 years being bound," Harry said, and felt, deep beneath his ribs, in the exact spot where a frayed seam had been fraying steadily wider for the better part of a year, something finally, completely, irrevocably give way. It did not feel like an explosion. That was the strange thing Harry would remember afterward, trying to describe it to himself in the quiet days that followed. It did not feel violent at all, not at first. It felt like exhaling after holding his breath for 11 years straight. The cords binding his arms and legs did not simply snap. They disintegrated, turned to ash and drifting cinders in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And the torches along the walls did not flicker. They roared all at once, blue flame leaping 3 feet high, and the stone floor beneath Harry's feet cracked in a spreading web pattern radiating outward from where he stood, and the mirror behind him shattered into 1,000 pieces that hung suspended in the air, frozen, glittering, waiting. Voldemort's red eyes went wide, and for the first time in that entire encounter, something in his ancient, twisted voice cracked with genuine, unguarded fear. "No," he said. "Not now, not like this, you cannot possibly be ready." "I don't think readiness was ever really the point," Harry said, and his voice came out strange to his own ears, steady, calm, layered with something underneath it that hadn't been there a moment before, something vast and old and entirely without malice, simply enormous, the way the ocean is enormous. "I think the point was that somebody should have asked me a long time ago instead of deciding it for me. And now it's too late to ask, because I'm not waiting for permission anymore." He didn't raise his wand. He didn't need to. He simply reached the way Dumbledore had taught him to reach for the candle flame, for the sphere of light, for the small, controlled increments of power he'd spent months learning to direct rather than suppress. Except this time there was no seam left to hold anything back, and what answered him was not a candle flame or a floating sphere. It was everything. The force that tore out of him was not chaos. That mattered, Harry understood even in the midst of it, feeling it move through him like water finding a channel it had been carving for 11 long years. It was not the blind, panicked violence of the train compartment or the flooded bathroom. It was directed, deliberate. He chose where it went, the way you'd choose where to point a beam of light, and he pointed it at Quirrell's body, at the thing clinging desperately to the back of his skull, and Voldemort's scream, thin, furious, terrified, tore through the chamber as raw magic slammed into him with the force of something that had no earthly business existing inside a 13-year-old boy. Quirrell's body was flung backward across the room, smoke curling from where the force had struck, and the parasitic, snake-like face on the back of his skull writhed and shrieked, and Harry felt something reach for him even as it fled, cold, grasping, desperate, a last, instinctive attempt to seize hold of something, anything, before it was torn away entirely from its dying host. It touched his scar. Pain exploded through Harry's skull, blinding and total, and for one terrible, endless second the whole world went white, and then something in him, something vast and patient and no longer bound by anything at all, simply refused it. He felt the cold, grasping thing recoil, felt it scrabble for purchase and find none, felt Voldemort's ancient, desperate spirit encounter. For the first time in 10 years, something it could not overpower, could not possess, could not even properly touch, and with a final, thin, furious scream that seemed to claw its way up out of the very stone of the chamber itself, it tore free of Quirrell's body entirely and fled, formless, screaming, out through the walls and into the night, leaving nothing behind but smoke and silence, and a body slumped motionless on the cracked stone floor. Harry stood in the middle of the wrecked chamber, breathing hard, magic still humming through every inch of him like a struck bell that hadn't yet decided to go quiet, and felt, for the first time in his entire life, completely, entirely, unmistakably whole. Dumbledore arrived 4 minutes later, robes billowing, wand already drawn, having apparated directly into the chamber the moment McGonagall's urgent summons had reached him. The Ministry Owl, it turned out, had been a fabrication, a distraction cooked up by nobody they'd ever identify with certainty, though Harry had his suspicions, and stopped dead just inside the doorway, taking in the scene. The shattered mirror hanging frozen in midair, the cracked stone floor, Quirrell's unconscious body, and Harry, standing at the center of it all, entirely unharmed, glowing faintly at the edges with residual magic that hadn't quite finished settling. "Harry," Dumbledore said very carefully, very quietly. "Are you hurt?" "No," Harry said, and found to his own mild surprise that it was completely true. "He's gone, Voldemort. He tried to take my scar, take hold of me, and it couldn't. There wasn't anywhere for it to grab onto anymore." He held out his hand, and in his palm sat a small, blood-red stone, warm to the touch. "He wanted this. I got it out of the mirror without meaning to. My reflection just handed it to me." Dumbledore looked at the stone for a long moment, and then at Harry, and something in his ancient, weathered face shifted into an expression Harry had never quite seen from him before, not the careful, deflecting warmth of a man managing a difficult situation, but something rawer and more honest than that. "The seal broke," Dumbledore said. "It wasn't a question." "It broke," Harry agreed. "All of it. I felt it go, right before I hit him." He met the old man's eyes steadily. "I'm not sorry it happened tonight, sir. I know you wanted more time to prepare me properly. But I think, if I'd waited for someone else to decide I was ready, I'd have been waiting a great deal longer than either of us could afford." Dumbledore was quiet a long moment, and then slowly, he lowered his wand and crossed the cracked floor toward him, and did something Harry had genuinely not expected. He knelt, bringing himself down to Harry's eye level, an old man kneeling on broken stone in front of a boy he had shaped and controlled, and in his own frightened, well-intentioned way, failed for 11 long years. "I am sorry," Dumbledore said, quietly, plainly, without any of the practiced grandfatherly warmth he usually wrapped his apologies in. Not for building the seal in the first place, I still believe, given what I felt that night, that an infant could not have safely carried what you carry unbound. But I am sorry for every year afterward that I told myself there would be a better time to explain it, and let that excuse cost you 11 years of understanding your own body. You deserved better than my fear, Harry. You have deserved it for a very long time, and I am glad, genuinely, deeply glad, that you did not wait for me to finally give it to you. Harry looked at him for a long moment, feeling something in his chest that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anger either, something quieter and more complicated than either, the particular hard-won piece of someone who has stopped needing an apology to feel whole, but is willing to accept one anyway because it's honestly offered. I know, Harry said simply. Let's just not do that again. Any of it. If something's mine to decide, let me decide it. I'll listen to advice. I won't always listen to orders. That, Dumbledore said, rising slowly to his feet, something almost like relief in the movement, seems an entirely fair arrangement. Quirrell survived, though barely, and was taken by ministry orders within the hour, babbling half-coherent fragments about a master he'd served and lost, and could no longer feel at all. A debriefing that would take weeks to properly untangle and would, eventually, result in a quiet, heavily redacted ministry file confirming that Lord Voldemort's spirit had indeed been present in the castle that year, and had fled, formless and weakened, into hiding somewhere beyond the reach of any tracking spell the Department of Mysteries could presently devise. It was in the chaos of that same night, oars moving through the dungeons and corridors, that a familiar face appeared briefly at the edge of the crowd gathered outside the hospital wing, Corvin Vane, credentials once again perfectly, legitimately in order, having arranged, through careful and entirely deniable means, to be present at Hogwarts that very evening on the pretext of assisting with the Ministry's response to what was being officially described as a security breach involving a member of staff. He lingered near the doorway of the hospital wing long enough to catch a glimpse of Harry sitting up in a hospital bed, Ron and Hermione flanking him, McGonagall hovering nearby with the strained, exhausted relief of someone who had spent the last several hours terrified of exactly the outcome that hadn't happened, and Vane, watching from the corridor with his notebook already half drawn from his coat, found himself, for the second time that year, meeting Harry Potter's eyes directly across a room. Harry didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Something in his gaze, calm, level, entirely without fear, carrying now an unmistakable weight of certainty that hadn't been there in Petunia's back garden 2 months earlier, made Vane's hand still on the notebook, made the careful, well-rehearsed opening he'd prepared die unspoken in his throat. Dumbledore appeared at his elbow a moment later, seemingly from nowhere, and his voice, though pitched low and pleasant, carried an edge Vane had never once encountered from the man in 11 years of careful, professional acquaintance. Mr. Vane, Dumbledore said, I understand you've taken a considerable personal interest in this school's affairs over the past year, visiting inspections, ministry records requests, a rather memorable garden conversation back in April that I only recently became aware of. His eyes, bright and cold behind half-moon spectacles, held Vane's without blinking. I would suggest very strongly that your interest concludes tonight. I have already spoken with the head of your department regarding certain irregularities in your recent conduct. Impersonating a welfare inspector to gain unauthorized access to a minor is, I understand, considered a rather serious breach, even within your department's usual latitude for unorthodox research methods. Vane's face went carefully, professionally blank, though something behind his eyes flickered with the particular, cold calculation of a man recalculating just how thoroughly his position had collapsed. I have never once wished the boy harm, Headmaster. Everything I have done believing it would ultimately serve. I am certain you believe that entirely, Dumbledore said, and there was no warmth left in his voice at all now. Grindelwald believed something very similar, once, about a great many things he did in the name of a greater good he was entirely convinced of. I would encourage you, in whatever time remains to your career after tonight's inevitable inquiry, to consider very carefully the difference between studying a danger and manufacturing a justification for treating a child as one. He inclined his head, a small, formal, entirely unmistakable dismissal. Good evening, Mr. Vane. I do not expect we shall speak again. Vane left without another word, and the formal inquiry that followed within the month stripped him of his position in the Department of Mysteries entirely. His 11 years of careful, patient research confiscated and sealed under restrictions considerably tighter than the ones he'd once bribed his way past, though he would, in the years that followed, never quite let go of the conviction that he had been right about the shape of what mattered, only wrong, fatally and completely. About who had the right to decide what should be done with it. Harry left the hospital wing 2 days later, in time for the end-of-year feast, and found Gryffindor Tower's common room already buzzing with the news that the House Cup had come down to the very last moment. Points awarded and tallied right there at the feast table for a series of acts nobody outside the trio fully understood. Neville, for standing up to friends far bigger than him when it mattered. Ron, for the finest game of chess Hogwarts had seen in years. Hermione, for cool logic under genuine pressure, and Harry himself, awarded points in an amount McGonagall read aloud with a small, private smile that suggested she knew considerably more about what had actually happened in that final chamber than the official version of events admitted. Gryffindor won the cup that year, banners shifting overhead from green to scarlet and gold in a burst of enchanted color, and Harry sat at the long table amid the noise and cheering, Ron pounding him on the back, Hermione laughing in a way he'd rarely seen from her, and felt, watching the whole hall celebrate around him, something settle finally and completely into place inside his chest. Not triumph, exactly, though there was some of that too, but something quieter and more permanent. Belonging. The simple, unremarkable, entirely extraordinary sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be, exactly as he was, with nothing hidden and nothing held back. The train ride home was different from the one that had carried him north 9 months earlier. He sat with Ron and Hermione, trading addresses and promises to write, and when the Hogwarts Express finally pulled into King's Cross and the platform crowd swallowed them all in a chaos of trunks and owls and tearful reunions, Harry found the Dursleys waiting exactly where they always did, Uncle Vernon's face already arranged into its usual sour, resentful mask. "No funny business," Vernon said, by way of greeting, glancing warily at the trunk and the owl cage as though they might explode. Harry looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way he'd learned to look at things this year, seeing clearly rather than flinching away, and felt none of the old, automatic fear rise up to meet the words. What rose instead was something calm and entirely new, the quiet, settled certainty of someone who understood, completely and for the first time, that he was no longer the smallest, most powerless thing in any room he walked into. "There won't be any funny business, Uncle Vernon," Harry said, and meant it, not as a promise extracted through fear, but as a simple statement of fact, one boy choosing, deliberately, not to frighten people who had once frightened him for no better reason than that they could. "Not unless someone gives me a reason for it." Vernon's face reddened, opened his mouth to say something sharp in response, and then, meeting Harry's eyes, steady, unflinching, carrying something ancient and vast just beneath the surface that even a small, cruel, ordinary man could sense without understanding, closed it again, and turned, wordless, toward the car park instead. Harry followed at his own pace, in no particular hurry, Hedwig's cage light in one hand, and did not look back once at the platform behind him, because for the first time in his entire life, he was not leaving anything behind that he was afraid to lose. Whatever waited for him at Privet Drive that summer, however small the room, however cold the welcome, he carried with him now something that no one, not the Dursleys, not Dumbledore, not a cold, patient man with a locked drawer full of secrets, and not even the thin, screaming remnant of the darkest wizard Britain had ever produced, would ever again have the power to take away from him without his permission. He was, at last, entirely his own.